All right, let's go live. Going live, and we're live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Gravity Max live stream. Today, we have great guest, Jacob, or Daikaiju Productions. How are you doing today?
Doing well.
Nice. And as always, my co-host, Sebastian, or 128 Seconds.
Hello.
How are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic. It's a rainy day outside, but, it's sunny in here.
Yep. Yeah, it is. It is a nice Sunday. It's a nice 3-day weekend from school for those of you in education. I don't know. A lot of people have to work.
Yeah.
Like tomorrow, I know you said you do, Sebastian.
I do.
But I think like people with like adults too. So yeah. But hopefully you're able to relax and enjoy Memorial Day weekend.
That's right. It is Memorial Day, so remember to remember.
Well, tomorrow, but yeah.
Yes, tomorrow.
Yeah. So yeah, that being said, let's just get started. Visit the Gravity Max website at gravitymaxmedia.com and also follow us on social media, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, or Patreon. Links to all those in the description. This is where you can get updates. You can get Gravity Max content. It's good. Also, follow Sebastian on social media, Instagram, and 128 Seconds on YouTube. Links in the description. Sebastian makes short educational videos similar to these live streams, but quicker because not everyone has like 2.5 hours to listen to us ramble, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you're a busy man, if you're on the go, if you're, that's the purpose. That's where you can go. And then, of course, Jacob has a channel, Daikaiju Productions. The link to that is in the description as well. It's a very great YouTube channel. I mean, you do a lot more, but you started off with like stop motions, and those alone were great. So it's like short films, both serious and funny. I think they're mostly comedy, would you say? I love them. I think they're great. So definitely go check out Daikaiju Productions on YouTube. All right. And then a somewhat odd start now on Amazon. It's been on Amazon for a while. My third book, third in the trilogy. It's the conclusion to my sci-fi trilogy. And yeah, it's fun. It's a blast.
It's a New York Times bestseller.
No, I don't think we can say that. I don't think we can say that.
Okay, no, it's not.
I think we'll get sued.
Every book is a New York Times bestseller. Come on, man.
Yeah, how many New York Times bestsellers do they name every year?
How can they all be the best seller?
That
difference between the bestseller and a bestseller.
That's true. That's true. What's their criteria then?
Yeah, I don't know. I kind of want to research that now. But anyway, if the book sounds interesting to you.
I just make a bet on it.
Yeah.
My bet is that Watch Mojo makes a video ranking them in order of copies sold, and then New York Times just copies off of that.
This may be true.
Anyway, that mystery aside, maybe one day we'll do an episode about the New York Times bestsellers. All right, now on to our today's topic. Not to get political or anything.
When you hear that sentence.
American political parties.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about the political parties in America. And so I guess we'll talk a little bit about the American system of politics just as a requisite. So the American political system is a little different from, I would say it's pretty different from like the European political system. I think there's similarities, but the European system is primarily parliamentary, whereas we have, I don't know what you would call it. I mean, congressional.
Yeah.
And in Europe, there tend to be more major political parties. For instance, England or the UK in general has the main two are like Labour and Conservatives, but they also have like Green. They have like a Scotland only. I mean, not Scotland only, but like in favor of Scotland, like a regional party. They've got a ton of different parties there that like actually have seats, whereas in the US, only Republicans and Democrats have seats in the federal government. So we do have third parties in America, and we'll talk about those today, but they are not as powerful as they are in European countries because they don't actually have any seats in any legislatures. So, yeah, that's what we'll talk about today. We'll talk about the parties, we'll talk a bit about the history, and then the present day. So, yeah.
Yeah. You know.
All right.
We can just hop right into it, I guess.
Alrighty. So we're starting with the history, and we're starting with the first party system. So American history of political parties is currently divided into 6 different party systems, and this sort of reflects the trends and makeup of the two parties, like where they draw their votes from during a given period of time, what their positions are, just what are they, right? And that changes over time. And yeah, so a lot of what we're going to talk about is just going to be brief in general, because we actually have a whole episode that we did like 6 months ago. I forgot what it's called, what our funny title was, but it was...
I think it was a series of unfortunate events.
Yes, a series of unfortunate events. The day before Election Day, or 2 days before Election Day. And we talked about all of the elections in American history. So if you want a very detailed account of this history, check that out, because that's a very good resource. So anyway, the first party system began with 2 political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. So let's start with the Federalists. So the Federalists, generally like led by Hamilton. You also had like John Adams, I think. And their position was that they were in favor of a stronger federal government, a more centralized system, in favor of things like a national bank that was like, I think, Hamilton's like signature legislation. Just generally more power vested in the central government rather than the state governments. That's the Federalist position. The Federalists, so there's 2 contexts. You'll hear the word Federalist, and that is pre and post Constitution. This is post Constitution. But before the Constitution, the Federalists were actually the ones in favor of establishing a Constitution, because before we had the Articles of Confederation, and those were, the Articles of Confederation were much weaker in terms of the central federal government. So it makes sense that the Federalists, who were in favor of instituting a stronger federal government through the Constitution, would continue to be in favor of a stronger federal government afterward. And their base of support was in New England, generally, the Northeast of the U.S. Do you guys have anything to add about the Federalists?
So these are the, I guess, ancestors of the Democratic Party. Although, obviously, they're not really called that. And it's a little difficult to draw like a direct tie between them. But, obviously, the principle of strong central government, that has definitely remained. And with the other political party, the Democratic Republicans, they also went by just the Anti-Federalists, if I'm remembering correctly.
So the Anti-Federalists were before the Constitution, and they were opposed to establishing the Constitution. The Democratic Republicans sort of formed,
right.
Like I think it's similar people, but it's like slightly different.
Yeah, I never watched. I know this is not the best historical timepiece, but I never watched Hamilton. I have never even listened to a song from the soundtrack all the way through. Like, someone I've been accosted in the hall numerous times with someone who's like, listen to this, and like it's Lin-Manuel Miranda just talking.
No, it's like you've got them covered.
Yeah, exactly. It's like running through that one scene from SpongeBob where they're running through like the perfume store and everyone's trying to give them like a sample of the perfume. Yeah, that's me going through the halls. But, you know, you've watched it, right? You said it's good.
Yeah, I've watched it. I watched it.
Jacob, have you seen it?
I have seen it.
Your thoughts? What are your thoughts?
Very good. The image of Thomas Jefferson doing Fortnite dances on a stage will never leave my mind.
Oh, Lord. Well, that's actually exactly how it went down in the Constitutional Congress or the Constitutional meeting.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You know, I enjoyed it. I just generally enjoy watching things, like any movie or play, or I'm probably gonna like it unless it's like egregiously bad. So that's where I'm at. I just generally like things that I watch. But yeah, so that's the Federalists. Another thing about the Federalists is that they were generally more aligned with Britain instead of France during this time period. This is around the time period of like the Napoleonic Wars at the beginning, and you had France and Britain not being happy with each other, fighting a ton of wars. I watched a video about the Napoleonic Wars, and it's crazy. There's just war after. So you start with the War of the First Coalition, and then the War of the Second Coalition, and it just keeps going. And I think there's like 7 of them. Like the last one is the War of the Seventh Coalition, and I'm like, geez, these are very creative names. But yeah, so the Federalists, that's another aspect, more closely aligned with Britain, and their opponents smeared them as like monarchists. During one of the presidential elections, we mentioned this between Jefferson and John Adams. Jefferson supporters and like the Democratic Republican newspapers accused John Adams of trying to have his daughter married to the royal family in Britain. They were like, he's going to turn the U.S. into a monarchy. And yeah, so that's where
that's a really, you got to think about it. That's a really strong defense. Like or I guess it's more of like an offense, to say they're straying towards monarchy because obviously they just came off of being ruled by Britain. But John Adams obviously was president before Jefferson. And so that means the Federalists are probably America's like first political party, like the original, and John Adams the first Federalist president because George Washington was based and did not have a political party. But
definitely. The Federalists, I would say, were there first, and the Democratic Republicans formed in response. So yeah, definitely. So yeah, this. Anything else, or should we go to the next slide?
I'm just gonna add on. Federalists did not make it better for themselves when Alexander Hamilton gave an elongated speech about how the presidency should be an elective monarchy.
Oh yeah, yeah. That
did happen.
Yep.
Yeah, that's not great.
Yeah, that's not good optics. But yeah, so let's go to the Democratic Republicans. So Democratic Republicans. They were centered around Thomas Jefferson. Again, if you watch the Hamilton play, but this is also just true. It's that in the first cabinet, in George Washington's cabinet, you had only 4 different secretaries, whereas today there's like 16 or 17. And Hamilton was the Secretary of the Treasury, and Jefferson was the Secretary of State. And they had a lot of arguing back and forth in that cabinet during that administration, and it ultimately ended with Jefferson saying, George Washington is being too deferential to Hamilton and the Federalists, so I quit. So he's out of there, and he starts his own political party and runs for president. So that's sort of the story behind the Democratic Republicans. So the Democratic Republicans were in favor of a looser, like a weaker federal government. And Jefferson's like principle that he based this on was, I believe it's called strict construction. And that is, I'm not sure, I forget what it was called exactly, but it's basically that the Constitution should be interpreted very strictly so that the government only has the power to do something if it is written in the Constitution. Hamilton's view was the government only doesn't have a power to do something if it isn't written that they can't do it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the sort of, and one of the big places where that sparked debate was in the creation of a national bank. Hamilton was in favor, Jefferson was opposed. Jefferson said, nowhere in the Constitution does it say you can make a national bank, so you can't make a national bank. Hamilton said, nowhere in the Constitution does it say I can't make a national bank, so I can make a national bank. So yeah, that's kind of the divide here. But then ironically, the Louisiana Purchase, which is like one of the best, I think a very famous, like good policy decision from Jefferson when he was president, was actually in violation of this view of the Constitution, because nowhere in the Constitution does it say like the president can just purchase a ton of land. But it was obviously a good decision because it doubled the size of the US and
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't that expensive. And so that's sort of an interesting like difficulty about principle versus like practical reality, right? And yeah, and it also was in line with the Democratic Republican voter base and base of support. So the Democratic Republicans were most popular out in the South and in the West of the United States. So just not New England, right? They were very popular with the farmers, and Jefferson had this sort of like Jeffersonian ideal. And that ideal was of, farmers working the land, and like that's America. His vision of America was like an agrarian America. So to purchase all that area out west, the Louisiana Purchase sort of it would help achieve that vision because that's just a lot more farmland that people can use. So that's sort of where the Democratic Republicans were standing. And finally, they were more aligned with the French rather than the British. And that was sort of a difficulty because the French were coming off the French Revolution, and that was violent, that was bloody, like way too extreme. But Jefferson's like, oh, well, they got rid of the monarch, which is like a good thing. They got rid of tyranny, but they also entered into like a new, different kind of tyranny. So that was like the difficulty. And just as the Democratic Republicans smeared the Federalists as monarchists, the Federalists smeared the Democratic Republicans as anarchists. They said, oh, they're going to bring the reign of terror over to America. It's going to be horrible. And that's the big debate. That's the big argument between these two parties.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that, because there is, as if there are Federalists still running around. There was a lot of friction between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Like it was heavily partisan, which is partially why, War of 1812 happens, and then you get the era of good feelings. Part of why everyone had such good feelings is because the Federalist Party, I believe, dissolved around that time, and that means that the partisanship dipped for a decent amount of time. And that's what you'd expect because America's relatively new. So people are going to have really, really strong emotions based on all of this stuff. So the partisanship was like really intense.
Yeah, so John Adams, who served one term as president, was the first and last Federalist president. So that sort of gives you an idea. After that, it was Jefferson, then Madison, then Monroe, or Monroe, then Madison. I forget the order. But just a ton of Democratic Republicans. And that is the era of good feelings, definitely. It is interesting. There were a lot of sort of conflict. In 1812, there was the Hartford Convention where a ton of Federalists met up to discuss like their policy and like what they should do. And some of the most radical among them said New England should secede from the U.S. and become its own country. So that made the Federalists look bad.
Yeah, feelings were high because, you know, they don't want America to be some failed state. Like, they have the country's future on their backs, you know? And there's no way that we can... Like, I don't think any future president will really have to endure that to the same degree. Because the last thing you want when you start a country is for it to fail immediately, you know?
Yeah.
Because then they would have to come crawling back to Britain or to possibly even France. They might have chosen France instead of Britain. And then, you know, all we would have would be French food and like little bakeries and just the smell of pastries wafting through the air. It'd be horrible.
Yeah, so that is interesting too. And with the War of 1812, the Federalists opposed going to war, and the Democratic Republicans were in favor of it because it was a war with Britain. And the Democratic Republicans didn't like Britain. The Federalists liked it a bit more.
And Jefferson was president during the War of 1812.
No, it was the next guy. I think it's Madison. Again, Madison or Monroe. Jefferson was president from 1801 to 1809.
Right,
he was involved in the lead up to the war with the Embargo Act of 1807.
Yeah, it was Madison. You're right.
But okay, Madison. Yeah. So yeah, that sort of sums it up a bit here. The main theme here is how centralized should the government be? Federalists say a lot. Democratic Republicans say not a lot.
And Madison was the other founder of the Democratic Republican Party, right?
Yeah, he was at one point, I believe, the Speaker of the House. And the House was more Democratic Republican, whereas the Senate was more Federalist, because at this time it was a lot more similar to, say, the House of Commons and the House of Lords, where the House of Lords, like in Britain, is just decided by the crown, right? In early America, the Senate was decided by the state legislatures rather than popular vote. They had to have the whole amendment about that. So,
yeah. So, Jimmy Carter must have been, what, like 25 around here? Jimmy Carter is timeless. He's ageless.
Timeless.
He is eternal.
Eternal. Jimmy Carter is eternal.
He is inevitable.
All right.
Yeah.
So let's move on to the second party system. So the second party system is the lead up to the Civil War. It's basically up until the Civil War issues become a major problem. And it comes right off of the era of good feelings. Naturally, when you only have one political party that's mainstream and in charge, the two largest factions of that party are going to become their own parties and split, and then it's back to the two-party system. It's inevitable. Like, if you think about it, if there's ever to only be one party, unless it's like an authoritarian state, right? If it's just one party has gotten so bad that they're just not elected anymore, right? The one party that remains is very quickly going to split. Just if you think about it logically, like it just seems like that is what I would predict to happen, right? And so that is what ended up happening. The Democratic Republican Party split into a ton of different factions centered around different people. And one of those people was Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson founded the Democratic Party. So if we go to the next slide, here we've got Andrew Jackson and the Democrats. So at first, the Democratic Party was called like the Jacksonian Democrats, because it was very much centered around Andrew Jackson. So in the election of 1824, everyone was officially a Democratic Republican running against each other. Andrew Jackson was one of them. He lost, and then in 1828, when he came back as a different party, his own Democratic Party. And the reason for that name is from a lot of sort of democratic efforts at that time. We sort of forget it because people always refer to America like as our democracy, but we are a republic. And back in this time period, that was especially so. It wasn't as democratic. Not as many people could vote. Significantly, obviously, minorities couldn't vote because, slavery, but also, and women, people who didn't own land as well. And that was the big issue for Andrew Jackson. He professed himself to be like a common man, right? And that's who he appealed to. He appealed to like common people that didn't own land. And through his presidency, that's where a lot of the landowning requirements for voting began to fade away. And it just became all white men generally. So that is Andrew Jackson, right? That's his position. I don't know. Do you guys have anything to say about this?
Andrew Jackson was insane. He was a completely just insane individual. Like the whole Trail of Tears things was pretty horrible, but he definitely left he's definitely one of the most notable presidents ever. Like that has to be said about him. But
he was also personally crazy. Like in terms of what he did as a person, like he was in duels.
Yes.
He after he was elected, he had like a party at the White House and totally trashed the place. And what else? Oh, and there was an attempted assassination on him, and he ended up beating the assassin with his cane.
Yeah.
Very weird things.
I think there's he was in an insane number of duels. I think.
I think it's 14 or something.
I thought it was higher. How many duels was Jackson in? Over 100 duels.
Over 100, wow. And it said that they've confirmed that he actually killed someone in a duel. So his political opponents said that he's a murderer. And that is an interesting issue because dueling, I think, was legal in some states, but not others at the time, which is weird, dueling. But anyway, in general, the Democrats, their party was sort of trying to appeal to the new voters, the new non-landowning people that were able to vote. And that meant that they opposed tariffs. That was part of Andrew Jackson's initial campaign. He opposed this tariff that John Quincy Adams put in place because the tariff benefited the local New England industrialists, but it came at the expense of the farmers of the South and the West. And that's because it was a tariff on industrial products to help grow the American industry. So, for instance, say farming equipment could cost $5 if you purchase it from Britain, where it's made cheaply and you can get it imported. But then after this tariff, since no one's able to buy anything from Britain, you have to buy the American tools that are, say, $10, and that increases your farming prices, makes people unhappy. So those are the sort of people that voted for the Democratic candidates.
Yeah. The extension of the vote to men without property, that's big. That was that's definitely one of the things he was most notable for. I looked into the duels a bit, and so out of the over 100 duels he did, he only killed one guy who was also completely insane. The guy's name was Charles Dickinson, and Charles Dickinson had already dueled a bunch of people in the past and had killed 26 of them. So
Jeez.
Jackson, gets in a heated argument with him. He had a famously, easy temper to break. So,
Mm.
they get in an argument. Jackson loses his mind, and he's like, you know what, buddy? Let's go. Let's duel. And against this guy who's, famous for being so good at duels that he's, killed 26 other people. So Jackson's like, I'll let you have the first shot. So Dickinson, takes his shot, shoots Andrew Jackson in the chest. This is in 1806. So he shoots him in the chest, but Jackson didn't move. So Dickinson wondered if he had missed, and then Jackson shot him, and later on Dickinson succumbed to his wounds. But it turned out that Dickinson hadn't missed. Andrew Jackson was just so insane that he just stood there and tanked it straight to the chest, and then became president 23 years later.
Mm-hmm. I think there probably is, but I think it would be very interesting to watch just a full-length documentary about solely the Jackson presidency from, 1829 to 1837. Because a lot of genuinely interesting things happened. But again, I would say go to our elections episode because we talked more about that there. You can skip to the Andrew Jackson part. And yeah, so let's move on to the Whig Party. So the Whig Party is that name, there was already a Whig Party in Britain, and the American Whig Party tried to model themselves after the Whigs. The Whigs are sort of a strange party. They formed in opposition to the Democrats, so they're a bit more aristocratic, but at the same time, their voting base is just very strange because the states that they held dominance in were some states in New England and some states in the mid-Atlantic, and then randomly Kentucky and Tennessee. It's very scattered, and that was definitely a situation that was going on. There were Southern Whigs and Northern Whigs. There were Southern Democrats and Northern Democrats. And as these tensions before the Civil War broke out began to escalate, that would actually be the death of the Whig Party, is that there were Southern Whigs and Northern Whigs, and they disagreed on slavery. And eventually that caused the party to collapse. So very interesting sort of situation here. You also have Henry Clay, famous Whig.
Famous dude who just couldn't become president. Yeah.
Never succeeded.
He's the founder of the Whig Party, right? I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, he is. So he's the founder. I don't know, what is there to say about the Whig Party?
They had two presidents, William Henry Harrison and Zachary Taylor.
And then two more, because both of the presidents they elected died in office. So then the vice presidents took over.
There you go.
Yeah. So it's originally it's opposed to Andrew Jackson. Yeah. So I guess okay. So that's another thing. Again, they were in favor of the tariffs to protect the American industry. That's why they were popular in the New England area where there was a lot of industry going on. They were also in favor of something called the American system. And this is how they got voters in the West and the South. The American system, which was never really fully implemented in this time period, was the idea that the federal government should fund infrastructure projects. The federal government should build railroads and canals and connect the country together, improve its internal improvements. It's improve just the infrastructure of the nation, make that a federal responsibility, which it hadn't been before. So today, I think we do probably have something pretty close to what they were proposing with the American system, where the federal government helps with infrastructure projects. I mean, the federal highway system was like built in the 50s, largely for military mobilization, but that is sort of the American system as proposed by the Whigs. So that is where they stood. And so definitely you have a very interesting voting base in terms of geographical region. Both parties drew support from all over the country. And that would quickly collapse as the country faced a very regional dispute, the Civil War. So, yeah. So let's get into the third party system. So the third party system is just before the Civil War and then after the Civil War. And it's pretty interesting that that is all together in the third party system. It seems sort of incongruous to me. I don't know. I feel like just around the Civil War should be its own thing, and then after is also its own thing. Feels very different. But yeah, so let's just get started. So here we have the Democrats, and I have a picture of Grover Cleveland. And it's kind of, he is in the later half of this time period. So what I'm about to talk about doesn't really apply to him. So if we're talking about the beginning of the time period, you had presidents like James Buchanan, and the Democratic Party was generally a pro-slavery party. It became a pro-slavery party. And the reason for that was that first you had the collapse of the Whig Party due to the slavery issue. You had Whigs in favor of slavery, Whigs opposed to slavery. That caused them to collapse. So then what happens is the Republicans form in the North, and we'll talk about the Republicans later. And when the Republicans formed, they were an explicitly anti-slavery party. They were opposed to the extension of slavery in the territories. Some abolitionists aligned themselves with the Republicans as well, because that would make the most sense. But they weren't, it was sort of a spectrum of how much they were opposed to slavery, but they were all generally opposed to it. And what that caused is it caused many Northern Democrats to leave the Democratic Party and become part of the Republican Party. And that left just the Southern Democrats to take over the Democratic Party. So during this time period, the beginning of this time period, they were pro-slavery. And then after the Civil War, more pro-segregation. And yeah, generally opposed to Republicans. So you guys have anything to add on to this?
I know Grover Cleveland for one thing, and one thing only. It's that he was like, what numbers were he?
22nd and 24th. Yeah.
Mad lad. Teleported.
Only person to ever do that. Yeah. Very, very interesting here. So the Democrats had the majority of their support in the South, the former Confederate states, basically. But they did extend into what we would consider to be North. For instance, New Jersey, I would say, is the northernmost state here that during this time period was under Democratic control, that voted for Democrats. So again, that sort of speaks to the nature here that the Democrats were generally a pro-slavery party, but like that's not how they founded. That's not how they started. They started with Andrew Jackson. Mm-hmm. Well, I guess at that point, almost everyone was generally pro-slavery. But the point here is that they were both Northern and Southern. But much of the Northern Democrats left to join the Republicans. So that is sort of the situation here.
We pop over to the Republicans.
All right. So, yeah, the Republican Party, founded in the late 1850s, they were a anti-slavery party. So, for the most part, it was about stopping the extension of slavery into the territories. The initial jolt that got people to organize to create the Republican Party was the Kansas-Nebraska Act, where, I mean, it's complicated, but before you had the Missouri Compromise that said certain territory would be entered as free states and other territory would be slave states. Kansas and Nebraska were part of the region that should have just been automatically free states. But then the government said they can vote on whether or not they want to be a free state or a slave state before they enter the Union as a state. So that enraged a lot of people in the North, and that sort of caused them to found the Republican Party. And the figure most associated with the beginning of the Republican Party is Abraham Lincoln. So, because he was the first Republican president and ended slavery. So that tells you a lot about what the Republicans are. But yeah, they are a Northern party. That's where they drew their support. Abolitionists would support them because even though, again, they had, in the beginning, they had various levels of opposition to slavery, it's, to the abolitionists, it's best that they just have any opposition to it because that wasn't where everyone was at the time, right? So, yeah. Like, I forget, because I think Lincoln's position when he first entered the White House was no more territory should become slave states, but we will leave already existing slave states alone. However, once the Confederacy seceded from the Union, that changed. He said, okay, well, we're going to abolish this slavery. So, yeah. But, yeah, so that's the Republican Party founded in this time.
Yeah, Lincoln is definitely the one most credited with the creation of the Republican Party. Certainly not really the modern one, but he's definitely most credited as their founder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So another party during this time period was the Populist Party. These guys are pretty interesting. Here I have a picture of William Jennings Bryan, and eventually he would become a Democrat.
A picture?
Well, yeah, it's a picture. I don't know.
It's a drawing.
It's a drawing. Well, sure, it's a drawing, but...
I mean, so is the one of Abe.
Oh,
yeah.
That's true. Yeah.
Well, it's a picture of a drawing. Well, okay, I didn't say photograph, right?
Mm-hmm.
Does a picture have to be accurate? I don't know. I don't know the strict definition of picture.
Define
but,
picture. Not picturesque. Yeah. Define picture.
Yeah,
wow, a painting or drawing. Wow.
There you go. I was right.
Wow, you got me. I really...
Yeah, I out-semanticsed you.
You out-semanticed me.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, we have William Jennings Bryan. He would become a Democrat, but originally he's sort of associated with the Populists. The Populist Party was a sort of agrarian party, and it sort of came out of the Grange movement, and the Grange is like an association that was like a union of farmers, kind of. So it's kind of like a union, like a workers' union, except for farmers. And the reason they needed this was that this is Gilded Age time we're talking about. So this is the second half of this time period. You know, peak Gilded Age, robber barons, right, monopolies, and one of those monopolies was the railroads. So the railroads were charging exorbitant rates to ship farms goods to the east and transport all of that. So in response, the farmers got together to form the Grange and then eventually the Populist Party. So yeah, the Populists ran a few presidential candidates, but they never won. They were a third party. They were pretty successful because they did actually win states, but they never won election. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. Their position is basically antitrust, anti-monopolies, and eventually the Populist Party would manage to, and this is in the next time period, the Populist Party would manage to mingle itself with the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party would take on the populist agenda, as well as holding on to the more Southern, segregation agenda. So that's a sort of interesting combination of, different things here. Also, yeah, William Jennings Bryan is just an interesting person. In my history class, we just did a mock trial of the Scopes trial, which was this evolution trial in
Ooh.
1925. It was about there was a law in Tennessee that made it illegal to teach evolution in the public schools. So this teacher, substitute teacher, John Scopes, intentionally taught evolution in a class so that he would get charged with this, and the ACLU basically like backed him, and we're trying to repeal this law, right? And so we did the mock trial in class, and I got to be Clarence Darrow, who was the defense attorney of Scopes.
Nice.
But the prosecution in this case was actually William Jennings Bryan, which is interesting because even though he's associated with like reforms, antitrust, anti-monopoly stuff, he was also a like fundamentalist Christian. So he believed that the Bible should be interpreted literally, and that was a movement in the 1920s, which is a bit later on. So yeah, it was pretty interesting. So I got to argue with a classmate who was pretending to be William Jennings Bryan. So it was fun. It was fun.
He ran like 3 times for president, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, every time he ran for president, it was as a Democrat, starting in 1896.
Mm-hmm.
But before then, he was a populist. And this comic is actually from his Cross of Gold speech, which is he was in favor of changing the American monetary system from a gold standard to a gold and silver standard. It was a position called bimetallism. We talked about this in our elections episode.
Mm-hmm.
And he basically said, do not crucify this country on a cross of gold. Because in 1893, there was a recession, right? It was the Panic of 1893. And the solution to that, according to the populists, was to start minting in silver as well as gold to allow for inflation to stimulate the economy, right? And that was William Jennings Bryan's plea, like, don't crucify this country on a cross of gold. Very interesting party temporarily, but they dissolved as the Democrats co-opted their positions. So yeah, that ushers us into the fourth party system. So fourth party system, this is like World War I and 1920s. This is what we're getting to. Yeah.
And
so
I would say
Democrat.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
We can go right into the Democrats because that's kind of what I was going to say. Obviously we're getting closer and closer to the modern stuff, but I like the strongest ties I really see with, and obviously we're going to get into like the modern political parties later.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of their strongest roots either begin here or in the next one, I would say, because the next one also contains FDR, and I would say the modern Democrats party, like the strongest ties they have back that go back the farthest, if you kind of get what I'm saying, are either with FDR or in this general time period. Not necessarily with Wilson, but the changes that were occurring during this time period are definitely like the I don't know what the word.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah. I mean, I think it's the Green New Deal, right? That's obviously an homage to the New Deal.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, but yeah, we'll get to that. So Woodrow Wilson, Democratic Party. So at this point, the Democratic Party was still largely pro-segregation, and most of their support came from the southern United States. I don't know. I don't know a lot about the Democrats in this time period. They weren't winning a lot. So you didn't have that many Democratic presidents in this time period. It was just like Grover Cleveland. This is a list of starting with James Buchanan, right? Listing only Democratic presidents. You had Grover Cleveland, and then Woodrow Wilson, and then FDR. That's how few Democrats there were in this time period. They weren't doing well because, again, they were associated with the Confederacy,
mm-hmm.
which meant that they did well in the South but poorly in the North. And yeah, even though so they changed during this time period in their other policies, but they still held on to that sort of position, that like Southern position, right? So it's like interesting, that sort of thing, but it makes it sort of hard to pin down what exactly the Democrats were during this time period, um, because when we think of Woodrow Wilson, we think of the policy related to World War I.
Yeah.
But yeah, uh,
I would say this is probably the period of the greatest change for the Democratic Party. Can be traced to the fourth this time period of the fourth election or the fourth party system. Because exactly like you said, like that is a wide range of people going from Wilson to FDR to like Truman. Those are polarizing figures. All three of those individuals are, I would say they're all pretty landmark presidents, definitely very notable figures. And they differ from each other to a significant degree. One thing I think that might run constant is more globalism, and this was obviously just the trend as countries are getting more and more technology. They're becoming more and more able to become more globalized, more like have a bigger hand in the global scale, or on the global stage. Like with Wilson creating the League of Nations, stuff like that, and with FDR and his actions in World War II, with Truman's actions in World War II. This was, I really see that as probably one of the only things that runs a little constant between those guys, between those figures.
yeah, yeah, that is a good point. Another thing about the Democrats during this time period, I would say, is that since they're in a weaker position during this time period, there's a lot of trying to like outflank what the Republicans were doing. In the what was it, the 1912 election, when it was Woodrow Wilson versus William Howard Taft versus Teddy Roosevelt, all three of them, the policy proposals from Roosevelt and Wilson were actually kind of similar, interestingly. So it's sort of weird. It's like the Democrats were trying to respond to the Republicans, trying to find a way to regain the power they had lost. And they had also just co-opted a lot of the populist agendas. So that's sort of where they are. I would say it's a bit more like, I would say the economic policies are sort of similar to what you might find from the Democrats today. Woodrow Wilson in World War I, he did a lot of regulating the financial system. I think he created the Federal Reserve, or his Congress, right? Federal Reserve Act was 1913. So there's a lot more of like a more government-centric approach to handling the economy. And yeah.
It's very interesting to think about how different America would be, and then by extension how different the world would be, if we had had someone from a different party in charge of the country during any individual war. There obviously people like to play the game of if we had had a different president during this time period, like, and they pick a specific individual, how would it shake out? But if we just take it up a level and just keep it at the party level, how would America have fared in World War I if it had been a solely like Republican leadership, or in World War II?
That is a really interesting question, especially in regards to World War I, because Woodrow Wilson kind of won election on a fluke. It was that Teddy Roosevelt and Taft couldn't like reconcile their differences, and so Roosevelt ran a third party campaign while Taft ran a Republican campaign, which split the Republican vote and helped Woodrow Wilson get elected, which is really interesting. So it's like simply if if Roosevelt had just been like, yeah, I think you're doing a good job, Taft, or like, oh, I'll leave it to you, or if Taft had done the same thing, they probably would have won. I would say if either Roosevelt or Taft hadn't run in that election, the other one probably would have won instead of Woodrow Wilson. So it is really interesting to think about that.
If Teddy Roosevelt had been president during World War I, there would not have been a World War II. I'm just throwing that out there. I love Teddy. We're not supposed to take a stance on stuff for this episode, but I'm
just pro Teddy Roosevelt.
I'm very pro Teddy Roosevelt.
Teddy Roosevelt is a Chad.
He is a Chad. Jacob, who's your favorite president?
Teddy is definitely up there.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a very loaded question, I must say.
I think
who's your favorite president before a certain date?
Yeah, I feel like Teddy Roosevelt would have done really well in World War One because he was very much for American intervention worldwide. He was building up America's Navy. He was the one who sent like the Navy all like on a worldwide, like round the globe trip just as to like flex on other countries.
Yeah, and he was just a good guy. You know, he really was. He had a good philosophy on things.
Yeah, I would say definitely watch. I think it's Alternate History Hub did a video. It's like 30 minutes long called like The Election That Ruined Everything. And it's basically about ragging on Woodrow Wilson. And how Teddy Roosevelt would have done much better. And it's a very interesting alternate history video. And I am a fan of alternate.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say, especially with if a different party was in charge during World War I or World War II, how would things have shaken out? That's great potential for alt history. But it's also an interesting fact. Teddy Roosevelt's daughter died in 1980. Like she lived for like almost 100 years. So that just puts like time into perspective, I guess.
Yeah, that is interesting. I think another interesting one is like Woodrow Wilson's wife was either at like Kennedy's inauguration or funeral or something like that.
Woodrow Wilson's wife was effectively the president for a decent amount of time.
Oh yeah,
because Woodrow Wilson had a stroke, and he like refused to like take some time off. So it was like kind of his wife that was dealing with things because
for the last year of his presidency, it's theorized that a lot of the president has to sign a bill into law, right? And it's theorized that and make executive orders. It's theorized that from the last year of Woodrow Wilson's presidency, many of those signatures may have been forgeries by his wife, which would be interesting. It would be interesting to find out that like some 100-year-old piece of legislation is actually bunk. And just like tomorrow, you just read the news and it's like, oh, like you can't, I mean, obviously this is the wrong time period, but like, oh, the Federal Reserve doesn't exist anymore. That was 1913, but you know, just something like.
Oh God! Imagine if the 19th Amendment was bunked because of that. That'd be horrible.
Oh my God!
When did
Yeah, I don't think the president
doesn't sign something; it just passes into law, though, right?
Oh yeah. That's right. The pocket veto, or you can't do that. Yeah, after 10 days, it'll become a law anyway. So that's actually fair.
It's been more than 10 days since the passage of the 19th Amendment.
Let's think.
Yep. Yeah. So never mind. Well, there is, so then the last technicality I have for you is the pocket veto, which is like if it's the last 10 days of Congress, of a session of Congress, and the president doesn't sign the bill in those last 10 days, then it's automatically vetoed, I believe. I don't know. It would be it would be interesting anyway. If like that might be a good like a fictional story, like a short story.
Or that has great comedy potential. Like just some really important bill, or maybe it might be funnier if it's like a really small bill, but other things are like built on it. So everything just kind of crumbles.
Mm. That would not be good. Yeah.
That or
Anyway.
veto is declared invalid.
Yeah. That'd be
Oh my
nuts.
God.
But
Yeah.
This bill that got vetoed actually passed.
Yeah. That would be an interesting.
That's the gold standard.
that's what I was gonna say.
Gold
That's what
standard.
I was literally the next sentence out of my mouth was we're back to the
Back
gold
to the gold
standards,
standard.
boys.
Yeah.
Oh, good lord.
Interesting. Yeah, but anyway. So let's go to the Republicans here. So the Republicans, we have Teddy Roosevelt
Yes.
and William Howard Taft.
Yes.
So in this time, the Republican Party had a conservative wing and a progressive wing. Teddy Roosevelt was the premier leader of the progressive wing of the Republicans during this time period. It's very interesting how he actually became president. It was that he was governor of New York, and when William McKinley was running for re-election, the sort of Republican establishment said, and the establishment was much more conservative. And so they said, we don't like this guy having such a position of power as the governor of New York. We got to find a useless job to get rid of him, temporarily, get him out of the picture. And so they chose vice president. That was a mistake, I guess.
Wow. I didn't even know that.
And so they're like, oh, he's safely stowed away. He's vice president. He can't do anything. Because now we have to think about this. In this time, vice president wasn't considered as that important. It was John Adams that said, my country in its great wisdom has come up with the most useless office in existence, or whatever. I'm paraphrasing here, but the vice presidency was largely a joke. And so Roosevelt was given the vice presidency, and they're like, okay, good. We won't have to worry about him anymore. Then he became president because McKinley got assassinated a few months into his second term. So just crazy. That's just a crazy story, right? So yeah, anyway, Roosevelt, we all know him as he busted the trusts, Taft too, to a certain extent. Also Roosevelt, conservationist, that kind of thing. That's what people think about when they think Roosevelt. And eventually he split off and created the third party, Progressive Party, for his 1912 election bid, whereas Taft sort of represented the conservative wing of the party in that election. So, yeah. And the conservative wing is obviously more in favor of this is fiscally conservative. At this point, I would say everyone is socially conservative for modern standards, even the people that are socially progressive for contemporary standards, right? So yeah, we have the fiscally conservative Republicans versus Roosevelt's we should stop with these trusts, get rid of these monopolies. Well, actually, it was interesting. Roosevelt's position was to deal with the bad trusts, but allow the good trusts to stay. So that was his position. So yeah, interesting. There was one instance where I believe it was some coal mine. The workers went on strike at this coal mine, and it was tanking the entire nation because this is a monopolistic company, so they control all the coal, and now there's just no coal because they're all on strike. And so what previous presidents would have done is they would have called in the military to put the strikers back to work, right? But Roosevelt instead called both the leaders of the union and the leaders of the company into the White House to negotiate, which was very new. The policy of the government was to be on the side of the corporation and ignore the union during this time period. So Roosevelt sort of switched that to say, you two must negotiate. And he actually threatened, if you don't properly negotiate, I can't let everyone freeze to death in the country, so we're just going to take the coal mine and operate it ourselves. He said he was going to nationalize it unless they sorted out their differences, which is just an interesting thing. They ended up sorting out their differences. enough. So the threat was never carried through. I'm not sure the threat could have been carried through, but, can't really nationalize things. I don't think that's in the Constitution, but he threatened to do it, right? So they're like, oh, he means business. So that's the two parties during this time period.
Yeah.
All right. Next, we get the fifth party system.
And yeah,
the fifth party system, the Democrats, this is like the rebirth of the Democrats. They were doing very well because during the final stages of the fourth party system, during the 1920s, the Republicans, it was mostly the conservative faction of the Republican Party that had taken control, and that was just very laissez-faire economics. Just let the companies do what they want to do. And that worked out well for the 1920s because, during the 20s, it didn't end up well, but it worked well because we were coming off of World War I. Business was booming, right? All the competition had just destroyed itself, because Europe practically imploded during the First World War. Everything was destroyed over there. So we're like, oh, we're doing great. All our businesses are doing well. And so that allowed a very conservative and very hands-off economic policy. But then once the Great Depression started, that policy that had been popular became very unpopular. And so what happened was the Democrats took on a more, again, allowing the government to regulate the economy, and that caused them to return to profit. So, yeah, let's start with the Democrats here. We've got FDR.
There he is. So,
there he is.
Well, yeah, like I was saying before, you can tie the farthest and strongest ties that the modern Democratic Party has is probably to FDR and his era, because this can be FDR's presidency, his administration can kind of be pointed to as where the Democratic Party started to become the modern progressive party, if you get what I'm saying. More like social inclusivity, so more socially progressive. Before, it might have been on the side of the Republicans, especially with Teddy Roosevelt heading the progressive era. So this is when it switched fields over to the Democrats. This is when the Democrats started becoming the progressive party. More workers' rights, especially with the New Deal, stuff like that. All of that culminated, and like we said, the fourth party system was kind of the greatest transformative era for the Democratic Party. They come out of that transformative era with FDR, and he heads the fifth party system, and he turns the Democratic Party into the modern progressive party.
Yeah, definitely. It's also said the New Deal coalition is what Roosevelt brought together. And it is very interesting. When the Great Depression first hit, Herbert Hoover, so it's interesting because from a modern perspective, he didn't do enough. But at the time, he actually did quite a bit, relative to what previous presidents had done. And I forget, there was I won't be able to find it, but there was a quote from Roosevelt where Roosevelt was criticizing Hoover's spending too much, which was interesting. And so Roosevelt, headed the New Deal, and that was just very popular across the whole country. So yeah, if you look at the map here, we don't have it, but basically the only places that are still Republican are Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, and then the states around Nebraska. Everywhere else is very heavily in favor of the Democrats. And this is also the period of time when African Americans began to side with the Democrats over the Republicans. Because before this, African Americans primarily voted for Republicans. because they were the anti-slavery party, and the first African American congressmen were Republicans, but this sort of shift occurred during the New Deal era because everyone became a Democrat, practically everyone. And after the era was over, the African Americans were still voting Democrat. So that's an interesting, because people wonder about that a lot. People wonder it's often said the parties switched. I would say it's a bit more nuanced than that exactly. But I think the sentiment is fairly accurate. I don't know. Have you ever heard that before? They say the party switched positions, because people always wonder the positions of the Republicans and Democrats during the Civil War versus the positions of Republicans and Democrats today. People are always like, what is it about that? How did that happen? And so they say the party switched, and kind of, it's nuanced, but yeah.
I would say
their voting base is kind of switched a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. The fifth party system was probably the greatest period of success going by party systems for the Democrats in history. You have 4 Democratic presidents during this time period. Let me see. FDR, this might be out of order. JFK, Lyndon B. Johnson, and Truman. Truman came before those other 2 I just said. Yeah. Arguably 4 of the most notable Democratic presidents in history all fall into the 5th party system. FDR, obviously, he had 4 terms, the longest term of any president. So this was a period of just incredible success for the Democratic Party, and one that the Democratic Party would ride this wave for quite a while. Arguably still to today, but
yeah,
it's really interesting because you can kind of look at the last party system as the Republicans' success with Roosevelt and Taft, just because looking at the lack of Democratic prowess, I guess, in that era, this was the Democrats bouncing back. So it's interesting to see that both of them had their runs.
I mean, it is really crazy. From the Civil War until FDR, again, there were so few Democrats. It's crazy to think that FDR is only 2 Democratic presidents removed from James Buchanan, right? Because it's Buchanan, Cleveland, Wilson, FDR. So there's only 2 between. That's pretty crazy. But yeah, and so another place, you mentioned Lyndon B. Johnson, and Lyndon B. Johnson, I would say, was also very instrumental in creating the sort of modern democratic economic position, because now Lyndon B. Johnson is often looked over, I would say, a little bit, just seen as Vietnam War, but one of his chief policies was the war on poverty. He wanted to reduce poverty, and this is in the 60s. So he established this set of programs called the Great Society, and that's where we get a lot of programs that we know today. I believe one of them, Medicare or Medicaid, I forget which one. Social Security came during FDR. Here, wait, let me look it up actually.
I'm pretty sure that was a lot of the welfare programs.
Yeah, it was welfare. It was Medicare and Medicaid under Lyndon B. Johnson, and Social Security was FDR. So, yeah, it's definitely very interesting. Also, Lyndon Johnson. This is another place where the Democratic Party sort of shifted. You had Kennedy was in favor of some civil rights legislation. He never ended up getting it through, and so it was Lyndon Johnson that got the civil rights legislation through, chiefly the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Now, those are very, very major pieces of civil rights legislation. I would say the 1964 Civil Rights Act is probably the most important piece of civil rights legislation. That's where you get you can't discriminate in hiring, or your customers, right? It's very important, I would say. And so that would be another place where the voting base is also shifted, because in 1964, the Republican nominee Barry Goldwater was opposed to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And so that sort of further alienated minority voters. And so that's why today minority voters generally are more likely to vote Democrat than Republican, because the Democrats had sort of like rebranded themselves and had like been in favor of very major civil rights legislation.
Absolutely.
Another sort of like piece that happened is that the Democrats were effectively able to distance themselves from the Southern candidates, from like the Southern policies. And that sort of happened because in like the 60s, you had a lot of third-party campaigns ran by Southern Democrats. You had, I think it was Wallace and Thurman, and they ran third-party campaigns targeted at the South, at Southern voters, and they sort of like drew away that base of support from the main Democratic Party itself. So, yeah.
Yeah. Pop it over to the Republicans with Ike.
Next, we got the Republicans. Yeah, we got Dwight D. Eisenhower over here. Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, and then President. So, yeah, the Republicans were definitely a smaller party in this time period. They were the opposition party. They were fairly weak. I think
they only had one.
Dwight was the only president.
He was the only
during this
one.
time period.
Yeah.
And Eisenhower wasn't very much like a Republican. Like he was a Republican, but he was much more of a moderate. And this is a trend you get where a party that isn't doing so well will find a popular general and have them run for president. The Whigs did it with Zachary Taylor. And like, you'll get this happening, right? And when that happened, it was also, the Whigs also did it with William Henry Harrison. So it's just kind of interesting how that happens. So that sort of speaks to how like poorly the Republicans were generally doing in this time period, because they needed to get Eisenhower, who was the leader of the army in Europe. They needed him to run for president, and that was the only way they could win, right? Like, that's pretty crazy. But Eisenhower's vice president was Richard Nixon, and so this is interesting. This is the second Red Scare, because the first one was during like the 20s and World War I, after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. But this is like the second Red Scare in the 50s. This is the Cold War is escalating. And so the Republicans took a very hardline stance on communism. Both parties did a lot of accusing each other of being communists during their campaigns. So that's just interesting. Like, both parties in both directions. So you'd have, like, I think Truman accused, I mean, not of being communists necessarily. Sometimes you'd get that, but you would also get, like, too soft on communism, things like that. And yeah, so that's sort of interesting. But the Republicans sort of get a lot of the hardline anti-communists. You get McCarthy. You get McCarthyism. McCarthy was a Republican. Yeah, so that's sort of where they are.
Yeah, for the Democrats to have their strongest run, the Republicans have to have their weakest.
Yeah.
But Eisenhower is still pretty notable, I'd say.
Yeah. And it makes sense sort of with the Democrats taking on a more like a increased policy of spending, like more spending. It makes sense that the Republicans would sort of take on an anti-communist and like anti-big government stance. So this is sort of where you get into the modern Republicans' position as well, of like a more limited government, because they're the opposition, and the thing that they can oppose is the big government policies of the Democrats at this time period. It is really interesting. I think in like 1928, the federal budget was like 3% of the GDP, and then I forget, like by the time FDR was done, it's like 17%, and it's like around there ever since. So FDR represented a very big fundamental change to the way that the government works and what we consider to be big government or small government. Because I think there were recently like budget proposals in Congress, and the Democratic budget proposal was like $6 trillion. I'm not sure what the Republican budget proposal was, but I can't imagine it was much less, right? So that is big. I'm not sure what our GDP is exactly, but $6 trillion is a very big federal budget. And that's just also with the COVID pandemic, lots of thing. But yeah.
There you go.
All right. So next we've got the sixth party system. So the sixth party system started in 1968 and maybe is still around today. It's not exactly defined. And the reason for that is that you sort of need a bit of hindsight before you can start differentiating these time periods, because you don't know the long-lasting historical effects of things yet. We don't really know that well the long-lasting historical implications of, say, George Bush's presidency, because that was still fairly recent, you know. Once all of that, like, once we're a few decades down the line, we'll probably be able to subdivide this a bit more. And we are probably in the seventh party system at this point. But again, it's like sort of unsure, right? So sixth party system started in 1968, not exactly sure when it ended. So the sixth party system was a high tide for the Republicans, I would say, not as much as the fourth party system was, but it was a like fairly high tide period for the Republicans. And I'll get to that in a bit. But what that meant for presidents like President Clinton is that even though he was a Democrat, he was a fairly moderate Democrat, partially because he just was a more moderate like politician, but then also because he had to deal with a Republican Congress. There's something, it's called, I forget what it's called, but it's in 1994, Republicans took back the House and the Senate, or one of them, I don't know, but they got control of both houses of Congress. You had Newt Gingrich was the Speaker of the House, and his campaign strategy was something called the Contract with America that a ton of Republican candidates signed and said, we are going to commit to these principles. And so that was a very strong opposition against Bill Clinton.
And this specific image is a little important, namely because this is after his impeachment trial, and in the aftermath of that trial, he was always mandated to be constantly standing when he's at his desk in the Oval Office.
Interesting. That is interesting.
Continue.
But anyway, yeah, the policies of this time period were, like, for the Democrats, it was sort of just a continuation, for the most part, of what they had done before. Primarily the shift that occurred due to FDR and Lyndon B. Johnson. I would say it's pretty similar to the modern Democratic Party as we know it. Talk about that more in a little bit. So, yeah, but they were sort of weaker, I would say, during this time period. They weren't as strong, you know. So, yeah. I don't know. Do either of you guys know a bit more about this time period for the Democratic Party?
Yeah, Bill Clinton, he's often joked that he's the most Republican Democrat in the modern era. But yeah, no, he was definitely much more of a centrist. He definitely he seems kind of like the odd man out if you look at the Democratic presidents before him and after him, because he didn't necessarily sign on to the social progressivism in the way that, like, say, Obama did, namely with legalizing gay marriage federally. Even though I'm aware that Obama was opposed to that when he came into office, he eventually was pressured into making that decision. And obviously, before him, before Clinton, there were bigger moves of social
Carter,
reform.
I would say.
Yeah.
Before Clinton was Carter, and then before that was Lyndon B. Johnson.
Yeah, so definitely not as much during the Carter administration, but definitely under the Johnson administration, the Lyndon B. Johnson administration, Clinton does kind of seem like the odd man out in terms of social progress.
Ooh, it's thundering.
Same with the national, the national debt, the federal debt. Clinton was able to get us in the black. I'm pretty sure with that he was able to kind of dig us out of that, which is strange for a member of the Democratic Party to do necessarily. If you just put it on paper, you would expect the Republicans to be more likely to get us out of it because it's in the name conservative. They're more fiscally conservative. They're holding on to their money, but Clinton was able to still, be a Democrat and still able to dig us out of that national debt. So he's really an anomaly in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Here's what I would add, and this is an interesting problem about the national debt. Everyone always talks about wanting to reduce the national debt, right? But the problem is what you have is, so the Democratic Party is in favor of increasing spending, but then the Republican Party is in favor of decreasing taxes, right? And you may think, but basically the problem with that is that the Democratic Party isn't necessarily in favor of increasing taxes, although they kind of have to. It's just no one likes increasing taxes, really. People may like the result of increasing taxes, which is increasing spending, but people don't like increasing taxes itself, right? And then the same thing with the Republicans. In order to decrease taxes, you have to cut social programs. Nobody wants to cut social programs. They want the lower taxes. And so what happens is that the parties, if you can have a new budget that both decreases taxes and increases spending, then both parties can say, this is a good budget. And they can say that we did a good job to their people. And then that results in an increased debt. So it is interesting about which party is actually better for balancing a budget. I would say it's kind of neither, probably. But I don't know. It would have to be both of them together, and they would both have to take a loss in terms of political capital, because they would both have to say okay, we're going to cut some social programs and we're going to increase some taxes. No one wants to be the politician that does that. I mean, that sort of tanked George H.W. Bush's reelection, because when he was first running for election in 1988, he said, quote, "Read my lips, no new taxes," and then he raised taxes. Not a good move. Right? So it's a very interesting political situation. And so it is interesting that Clinton was able to get a balanced budget. But yeah, so a big reason for the Democrats not being as prominent during this time period is, I would say, due to the economic conditions, just the conditions of the country in the 70s, and then Jimmy Carter. So the 70s were not a good time in terms of the American economy, in terms of the American faith in the government, and in terms of the Americans' power on the world stage. So we pulled out of Vietnam, right, which is a good thing because now people aren't being sent to die in war. But it also meant that South Vietnam fell to the communists, and that was a bit of a blow to the national spirit, right? And then you had the Watergate scandal, which is like the biggest political scandal in American history, resulted in the president resigning from office, only time that ever happened. And then you had Jimmy Carter, and there were a ton of crises during the Carter administration. And I don't know. The problem is that a crisis only happens once, so you can't. It's hard to tell, like, oh, someone would have handled it better. But I think it's generally considered that Carter didn't do a great job. I'm not sure. I think he's a good person, but I don't think he did a very good job as president. I don't know if, like, what opinions you've heard about that. But, you know, there were a lot of different crises. And so that basically added fuel to Reagan's campaign and helped him get reelected. Like, one of the biggest things was that during the election, like the campaigning for the election of 1980, was the Iran hostage crisis. Like, that was actively occurring. And so it effectively made it that Jimmy Carter couldn't campaign, because if he campaigned while the hostages were still in Iran, it would look horrible in terms of optics, right? I mean, think about it. At every single campaign event, the people there would be saying, why aren't you back in the White House, like, getting those hostages out of Iran? And so that was a big blow to his campaign. I mean, you also had stuff like 1977, I believe, was like the coldest winter since 1933, like bad luck stuff like that. Yeah. And so that led to Reagan and his more like patriotic, limited government, like gung-ho, like platform. And that fit well with the American people. The Americans were like very responsive to that campaign strategy, because the 70s were just like a very big blow to the national pride. But yeah, so let's get to the Republicans. So we have Reagan. Yeah, as I said, the Republicans were riding the wave of renewing America's confidence and its power on the world stage and just prosperity. Oh, it's thundering pretty heavily here. But yeah, so Reagan's platform was about reducing spending, right, and a more laissez-faire economic system, reducing regulations and stuff like that. And the 80s, as opposed to the 70s, actually faced an economic boom. The 80s was a very prosperous time economically. And it sort of returned the confidence in like the American spirit. And then, of course, you had George H.W. Bush presided over the collapse of the USSR. He was president when that happened. And so Reagan and Bush sort of together like ended the Cold War in an American victory, like that when they were president. So that's sort of the attitude you have, you know, like a more patriotic kind of like, there's more reason, I guess, for Americans to be proud during this time period. And the Republicans played well off of that. So, yeah. And again, very similar policies to today. I mean, Republican candidates like love to talk about Reagan, and they love to try and compare themselves to Reagan. They like to say like, oh, I'm trying to be like Reagan, right? Whereas the Democrats, I would say, I don't know, what figure would you say they try to relate themselves back to?
Interesting.
I feel like it would be FDR or Lyndon Johnson, but
Democrats really don't do that. Like,
yeah,
I was thinking about that right before we got on stream, is that Democrats don't really point to, like, obviously everyone points to the founding fathers. That's just a universal thing, which was popularized after the Gettysburg Address, where Lincoln famously does that. But outside of the founding fathers, Democrats really don't do that. And I think it has something to, especially modern day Democrats, I think it has something to do with the heightened focus on social progressivism, because the issue is with a lot of past presidents is that they might have made good moves economically or good moves on the global stage, but socially they were incredibly limiting and incredibly conservative. So I feel like that might be a really big obstacle to them.
Mm. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Because yeah, I agree. You don't hear it as much. You don't hear Democrats as much like comparing themselves to previous figures. Whereas, yeah, the Republicans, it's Reagan. They like to talk about Reagan. So, yeah. And it's interesting. Reagan liked to, like, his model president was Calvin Coolidge from the 1920s during the height of sort of the fiscal conservatism. It's pretty interesting. It's all really interesting. But, yeah, so that's sort of recent history. And I think that brings us
To today.
to today. So, yeah. So 6th or 7th. Right now,
We're probably in the
right
7th.
now it's the 6th. Yeah. So here's the thing, right? Like right now it's the 6th because no one has, like, it hasn't been accepted a dividing date. No one has figured out a date that the 6th party system ends. So we're still technically in the 6th party system. However, in 20 years, historians talking about 2021 will probably say we're in the 7th party system. So that's your.
I'm going to throw out a date 2016. Well, not like a year, 2016. I think that there was a major shift in both parties then.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I might also say maybe like 2008 with the recession, or that might be where I might put it. But yeah, definitely 2016 too.
The Republican Party.
It is. Yeah.
The modern, like the right now Republican Party is fragmenting.
Mm-hmm.
There are the people that are kind of more aligned with Trump and those that are kind of trying to separate themselves and distance themselves from him. And I think those are going to be the two major fragments, and we'll see, which one wins out. But currently, the Republican Party is in a metamorphosis period. A little similar to the fourth party system for the Democrats. I believe that the seventh party system will be a really big metamorphosis for the Republican Party. Might even be the largest and most drastic changes. Because, a lot of people like to say that America right now, I believe it's the Overton window, the average person is more to the left than it ever has been in American history. And usually what that means is that the party opposite to wherever the Overton window is has to adapt. So I believe that is going to be the case. Like, if you ask me to predict what's going to happen in the next, throughout this party system, say that the seventh party system started in 2016. My prediction from 2016 up until the end would be until whenever the eighth party system starts would be characterized by more pronounced Democratic leaders and a few Republican leaders, but only those that are more to the center, kind of like with Eisenhower, how he was more towards the center. That
is
would be
interesting.
my prediction. Yeah,
because I would say that not as significantly, because the Republican fracturing is like centered around one person.
Yeah.
But I would say the Democrats also have very two major wings. You have the like progressives and the moderates. Although they are sort of able to be more united because in recent memory, there is not a person more polarizing than Donald Trump.
Yeah.
I would say it's one of, it's gotten to the point where it's like, if you were to like run a political campaign, you want to like put your position on important issues, right? So you might want to say like where you stand on like gun laws or immigration or things like that. I would say it's gotten to the point where your position on Donald Trump, just as a person, is like also an equally important
major issue. Yeah.
So it's kind of like a very interesting like political scenario where it's like this one person very much like is a very heavy topic of conversation, right? Um, like, yeah, I mean, we were reading through the like party platforms before, and the Democratic Party platform very frequently, when they mentioned what they're in favor of, they say, as opposed to Donald Trump. And that's sort of interesting. But anyway, let's get into it. So let's start with the Democrats. So here we have sort of the two wings of the Democratic Party. We've got Biden and then Bernie Sanders. Biden is the more moderate faction of the Democratic Party, and Bernie Sanders is sort of the more like progressive. Like, does he self-describe as a democratic socialist?
Yes.
He
think he
does,
does,
but his policies don't reflect that.
Okay.
Because like he says I'm a socialist, but he doesn't say full nationalization of all industry. He's not gone that far.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you do have a faction, and I think it would also include like Ocasio-Cortez as a democratic socialist, or like, and these are people that say I'm a democratic socialist, not like a slander, because I would say one of the, again, like how all the way back to like Federalists and Democratic Republicans, they'd smear each other as extremes. You'll get like Republicans saying Democrats are socialists. But in this case, these are people that are actually say themselves that they are democratic socialists. So there you go. But yeah. So let's go through, I guess, the main issues and the stances, right? So according to the Democratic Party platform, the Democrats are in favor of a like public option for healthcare. So this is a form of universal healthcare, but there's a lot of different things within universal healthcare. So the more moderate version is, I would say, the like Medicare for all public option type, which says you don't have to have government regulated healthcare, but if you can't afford private healthcare, then you can have access to government healthcare. So that's different from, say, I think Bernie's proposal was actually like it should all be universal healthcare. I think that's what's it called? Single payer.
Yeah, so Medicare for all, single payer. And what Biden wants is like Medicare for all who want it.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the difference there. You've got Biden, and so the Democratic platform is Medicare for all who want it, whereas the more progressive wing will say Medicare for all, period. So, yeah. Other things they mention, the Democrats like to talk about like social issues. Like they put, like that's what they talk about. So yeah, I don't know as much about that, but I don't know if you guys are more knowledgeable about like the social issues, but
I'm just going to talk a bit about why I think that these Democrats are different, and especially like what happened in 2016. I think the 2016 date is more important for Republicans and Democrats, but still important for Democrats because look at in the past, like Bill Clinton ran on like abolishing welfare as it was known at the time, and in 2016, that's when you see the Democrats starting to return back to the FDR. Like FDR was saying, like a jobs guarantee program, universal health care, stuff like that. And that's when you see figures like Bernie Sanders really starting to push back to the left. And even Biden, who bills himself as a moderate, is much more progressive than past presidents. Even Obama, if you look at what Obama passed in the Affordable Care Act, it wasn't even a fully universal healthcare system. And even Biden, the moderate, is now saying, we want universal healthcare. And the other major shift in the Democrats, I would say, is that there's a lot, as you were saying, there's a lot more focus on social issues. And that's kind of become the major divide is not necessarily the economic positions, although there is a divide on that, but rather like a culture war is what they're calling it now. I think that
Yeah.
became prominent.
Yeah, that's very well said. Yeah, like culture war issues. Yeah, that is very interesting. So yeah, a lot of the other stuff they do on the platform, they say they want a $15 an hour minimum wage by 2026. I don't know where their progress is on that. I think they had a bill in it before, but then like that section was removed from the bill. So that's $15. When was the last time the minimum wage was increased?
I believe.
Now it's at $7.25.
I believe.
When was that?
2009.
Yeah.
Okay. So they want to increase it to 15.
Yeah, it's been at 725 since 2009. Yeah.
Okay. Oh yeah, another thing is like sort of reform with education. They want to provide. I think Biden was saying this about like universal like preschool. I hadn't really heard that before. Maybe a little bit, but I remember Biden was talking about that. But then also college, like student debt forgiveness. I think Biden said like something like 2 years at community college will be free, something like that. I forget exactly what his position was on that, but he said like we want to offer like a 2-year program, and then I don't know, but sort of that sort of position. It is interesting because it's like it is moderate compared to the progressive wing, but it is like fairly new stuff, I guess, being introduced. I don't know, but yeah. Then again, there's a lot of like, I guess you could say, culture war issues. There's some like interesting things in there, like something called like climate justice. And so this is an interesting thing. It's like it's a policy opposing climate change, but then it's also about social justice at the same time. I don't really understand the connection that much, but that's I don't know. That's part of their platform.
I think that you can largely summarize today's Democrats by saying that they want more government if it involves spending money, so things like education, healthcare, or changing over to green energy. They want more government in that area, but they largely want less government in areas where it involves like individuals and policing. So they want to both like scale back the actual police force, but also like on substances, they're more friendly to legalizing substances and I think notably the other two areas where that's most pronounced would be abortion and LGBTQ plus rights. They're more friendly towards steering away from government intervention in those areas, and that's not like a hard rule. There's areas where the Democrats don't like to spend money, and there's areas where the Democrats are in favor of more policing. But I think that's like the general rule.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess probably the most prominent like exception to that, I would say, is their position on the Second Amendment. It wasn't actually mentioned in the platform unless I missed it, but Democrats are generally more in favor of gun control laws, and Republicans are opposed to that. And so, yeah, that would probably be your main exception. But other than that, yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. Yeah. All right. Anything else? That's it for me.
Yeah, I think going back to this last election, there were a lot of Democratic candidates. I forget the exact number about how many there were.
Oh, I think at one point, so this is in terms of recognized by like whoever sets up the debates, there were 20.
Yeah.
Because you had like the first Democratic debate was like split into 2 nights where you had like night 1 with 10 people and then night 2 with 10 people. So yeah, there were a lot of different Democratic candidates.
I feel like that either shows a party's strength Or it could also be taken to show like weakness, how there's not really one thing for a party to rally behind, so there's a lot of candidates, or the party is flourishing, so a lot of viewpoints are able to be perforated and are able to be shared, so there's a lot of candidates. And I would say it's kind of the second scenario on this one. The Democratic Party is very powerful now, I would say. And especially they're very popular among the younger generations, millennials and Gen Z.
Yeah, that is in the voting demographics. It's younger people tend to vote Democrat, older people tend to vote Republican, minorities tend to vote Democrat, white people tend to vote Republican, and then I forget well, you have a few more. Then you have like women tend to vote Democrat, men tend to vote Republican, and I think the last one I remember is people with a college education are more likely to vote Democrat, and people without are more likely to vote Republican. So yeah.
So yeah.
At least based on like 2016, Hillary versus Trump.
Yeah, I think that was a show of their strength. I would say that it was the second scenario there. And, you know, it was interesting. A lot of funny things came out of that whole scenario.
Yeah, you had a lot of very interesting candidates. Andrew Yang sticks in my mind the most just because of the policy proposal, the universal basic income, which is just a very like unique policy proposal. I hadn't really heard of that, so I found that pretty interesting. But yeah.
But I think we can hop on over to the Republicans.
All right, yeah. So the Republicans, lower taxes. They campaign on like law and order. A lot of this stuff is like has been around for a long time, which is interesting. And I think that sort of speaks to like the shift that is occurring in the Republican Party, is that they've probably been like relying on old tactics for maybe like too long that it's like not working anymore. Because, for instance, like Trump's campaign slogan in 2016, "Make America Great Again," was actually also used by Reagan. And then this time around, he talked about law and order, and that was a phrase used by Nixon. So, like, very interesting, like relying on these like older Republican candidates. So, yeah, but yeah, lower taxes, law and order, which is just like more, I guess, like cracking down on like tough on crime kind of thing. Then they have like a pro business approach to job creation. Like they want a very like business friendly environment. It's sort of, you could say like Reaganomics, trickle down economics. Probably not to the same extent as Reagan himself, but that's the general principle they're relying on, is that if the big companies are doing well, they're hiring more people, and so then the people are doing well. Which again, like I would say mixed results on that. Yeah, then a lot of focus on the Bill of Rights, on like First Amendment issues against Second Amendment issues, very like pro like gun, so very opposed to any sort of regulation on firearms. And then in terms of First Amendment, the Republicans tend to be the more like religious party in terms of like their rhetoric. I mean, I think it was like the 80s and 90s, like when Reagan was elected, it was largely due to there were like televangelists, and the televangelists would both preach like Christianity and Republican Party values, which is sort of interesting. It gave rise to what's known as like the religious right. So that is sort of a factor in the party. And so that sort of carries into some of their policy proposals, like, for instance, on the abortion debate, you know, pro-life rather than pro-choice. And yeah, then Republicans are also in favor of more free trade. And this is an interesting one because Trump wasn't. and you had a lot of, like, I would say, tension between Trump and other Republicans on that, just based on the trade policies. Trump, I think, imposed a higher tariff on China, and Democrats, as well as many Republicans, were opposed to that. So, because the Republican Party platform itself is in favor of a more, like, globalist, like, trade policy, and so that's an interesting sort of shift there. I'm not sure, like, who will end up winning that debate. But yeah, then you generally have America First, like, positions, which just says, like, prioritize America over, like, I don't know, philanthropic efforts, right? And then they're also in favor of, oh yeah, on the party platform, this is from 2016. They're in favor of a balanced budget amendment still. So that is interesting. Again, we talked about that a bit earlier. And then also, interestingly, they have preserved Medicare and Medicaid, and they talked about, like, preserving protections for people with initial conditions, but they are opposed to expanding those programs. And then they are fine with legal immigration, but then they are very opposed to illegal immigration. And then, yeah, they're just also more laissez-faire in their economics. Like, they don't appreciate, like, regulations as much. And then finally, they generally support, like, American values, like, whatever that means exactly. Sort of, like, again, like, a bit of, like traditionalist, I guess. But yeah, that's what I would say there. If you guys have anything to add, feel free.
Yeah, I think just talking earlier about 2016 as a shift to the seventh party, and I think is really pronounced with the Republicans because of Donald Trump. He shifted the rhetoric a lot. His rhetoric was a lot more populist, but even in policy, he took on a more anti-corporate at times. Like, you see how he bashes big tech at times, or liberal corporations, or stuff like that. And he was less pro-free trade. And I think that is one of the biggest shifts. Also, there's the culture war stuff. That's gotten more popular. It started earlier, but it's especially with Second Amendment issues. Because I believe Trump is the first Republican president in a while who's not outright said that he would sign an assault weapons ban recently. Like, he said that he would back when he was a Democrat, but he's not said that again as a Republican. So, issue, like the Second Amendment and other culture war issues, have really gained prominence lately, as have a bit more of a populist lean to the Republican Party. And that's why I think that the Seventh Party started in 2016.
Interesting. Yeah, and another, like, aspect of the, like, increased tariffs was an effort to keep more jobs in America. So that sort of, like, fits with the trend that you were saying before. So yeah.
But yeah, Republicans, kind of the opposite of the Democrats. That's what you get in a two-party system.
Yeah.
Less government on spending, but they're more supportive of police, tough on crime, and less. There's less of a gap on the military, but they do tend to be more military spending as well.
And they're going back all the way back to talking about partisanship. It's very partisan right now, and it was incredibly partisan during the 2016 and the 2020 elections. If we go back and we look, partisanship has kind of been on a rise, I would say, since the Reagan era. Like, it was a drastic increase during and after the Reagan administration. And now we're seeing what I hope to be the peak of that partisanship, because I hope it, obviously, I hope it goes down from here and there is more, I guess, collaboration across the aisle, stuff like that.
Yeah,
That's
more
what you like to see.
cohesion.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that makes sense. Um, yeah, so I guess that covers it. So this is interesting with the two-party system. Uh, we researched House caucuses, House congressional caucuses, and these caucuses that we found, there are many different caucuses for different issues. Like you'll have say agriculture or something like that, and it's about people that are say very much in favor of farming subsidies and things like that. But then there are a few caucuses that are specific to sort of ideological position, and there are 6 of them in particular, 3 per party, that sort of divide the parties into their 3 different wings fairly well. And so that is what we want to go through right now to sort of give the different the nuances in within the 2 parties. So yeah. All right, so let's begin with the Blue Dog Coalition. So the Blue Dog Coalition is sort of the self-proclaimed moderate centrist Democrats. And here are the 3, I think the 3 chairs of the Blue Dog Coalition. It's Ed Case, Stephanie Murphy, and Tom O'Halloran. I haven't really heard of these people before, so they're not as prominent. And I think that makes sense. Probably on both sides, the most prominent people are the ones at the 2 extremes, because that's the most newsworthy. If you think about it, right? That's going to get more clicks or whatever. So the people in the center don't really get as much attention. But yeah. So the Blue Dog Coalition, their position is on their website. They emphasize a lot the being in favor of fiscal responsibility, and they say that phrase many times. It's kind of interesting. They repeat the phrase fiscal responsibility, fiscal responsibility, fiscal responsibility. So that is that's what they're in favor of. Their healthcare proposal is to reduce healthcare costs. We didn't really look into it enough to see how exactly they want to do that, but it's not a universal healthcare system. It's reduce healthcare costs.
I feel like there's a variety of opinions within their coalition, so they can't really make one real statement.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's a lot more willingness to be bipartisan, obviously, since they brand themselves as the centrist coalition. So yeah, just more efficiency in government. They are in favor of maintaining military spending, which Democrats are generally in favor of slightly lower military spending than Republicans are. But the Blue Dog Coalition isn't really that much in terms of that. So yeah, and they didn't really mention social issues a lot either. So that's interesting. And I think that might be who they're trying to appeal to. I think there's a lot of moderate Democrats especially in 2018, that were trying to get elected and using kitchen table issues, which is everyday sort of jobs, wages, things like that, things that are very important to just average people. So that's sort of who they appeal to.
Yeah. So while we were looking at these, so this is the most moderate of the Democrat caucuses. But we'll get into the Republican caucuses later. But it was a little interesting, and this is obviously up for interpretation. But with the Blue Dog Coalition, it being the most moderate of the Democratic caucuses, the most moderate of the Republican caucuses almost looked more left-leaning than the Blue Dog Coalition, which is a little interesting. But again, that's up to interpretation, and we'll get to the most moderate of the Republican caucuses a bit later. But
I would say the key thing,
interesting.
Yeah, I would say the key thing here is the social issues.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably because I agree, it kind of looks like that. And I think it's about the social issues. I would say the 2 most centrist, and again, we'll get to them, but the 2 most centrist coalitions here are probably pretty similar fiscally. Mm-hmm. But the difference is that the Blue Dog Coalition generally doesn't talk as much about the fiscal issues, whereas the Republican Main Street Partnership, as it's called, did talk about social issues from a more Democrat-leaning perspective. So that is interesting. Like the explanation for, and I feel like the explanation for that is that the Blue Dog Coalition are appealing to Democratic voters that aren't as into the culture war issues, whereas the Republican Main Street Partnership are appealing to Republican voters that are more into that sort of side of things, right? It is pretty interesting, the differences there.
I think there might be two different types of blue dogs as well.
Mm-hmm.
There's the blue dogs who are trying to appeal to rural voters who might be more socially conservative, and then there's blue dogs who are trying to win like really well-off districts that don't want to see their taxes go up and really want to protect like their own financial well-being, but also might be more socially liberal. So that's I think why you have a very vague platform on their website where they don't talk that much about social issues, and they don't have like a very well laid out healthcare plan, is because there's, even within the Blue Dog Coalition, there's a bit of a divide between those two groups.
Very interesting. Yeah. So, all right, let's go to the next one. So the next one is the New Democrat Coalition. And I would say this is like the center line Democrat position. Like this is sort of, this coalition itself is closest to the position of the Democratic Party as a whole. The two people we have here are Adam Schiff and Val Demings. You may have heard those names before. Those names stuck out to me. But on their website, the New Democrat Coalition, it's very interesting. They mention a lot about working with the Biden-Harris administration. So they say like the place that we got their like positions on the issues was called like the first 100 days, obviously in reference to Biden's first 100 days. And they talked a lot about working with the Biden-Harris administration. So I would say this is probably where Joe Biden, in terms of how the president interacts with Congress, this is probably where Biden has his base of support in terms of the policies that he favors. Like this is his congressional base of support. So their position, they obviously are in favor of the Affordable Care Act, and they want to deal with climate change, and they talked about social issues. They talked about social justice, not as much as the next coalition does, but it is definitely there. Again, about as much as Biden does. I feel like this is probably where Biden is. We can't exactly know because Biden was a senator before he was president, and this coalition, strictly speaking, is just in the House of Representatives. So we don't actually know where Biden was, but I would guess if Biden had been a congressman at one point, he probably would have joined this coalition. But that's just like my judgment. I don't know. So
yeah, I would agree with that. While he was on the stage with the other, like next to the other 20 or 19 candidates for the Democratic nomination in 2020. He definitely stuck out as being more centrist, being more in the center. That might have also just been because there were a lot of polarizing figures on that stage, like Elizabeth Warren and I guess Sanders are both definitely much more progressive. With Yang and his universal basic income, that's definitely a very polarizing issue. So Biden kind of stuck out as being more of a centrist in that regard, but when like put on an actual scale, I do think that he would probably fall into this and not into the Blue Dog Coalition, as a lot of what he's been saying, or I guess the NDC is kind of more like, as you said, they made a big point that they're going to stand with the Biden administration and stuff like that. So it looks like they're kind of playing off of him. But obviously, when this was in existence, if he was a House representative, I do definitely believe he would have joined it, because a lot of a lot of their viewpoints line up. And obviously, Biden, I don't think he would have fallen into the progressive caucus. He definitely talks a lot about social progressivism, but he doesn't commit to the fiscal side that that the progressive caucus subscribes to, which is why I think he would land in the NDC.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah. So again, a lot of what we said just about Democrats in general, like when we're talking about the Democrat Party platform, I feel like that is fairly closely in line with the New Democrat Coalition, like their position on things. Yeah.
Yeah. So going off to the farthest left-leaning House caucus, the Progressive Caucus.
Yeah. So the Congressional Progressive Caucus, these are probably where you get your most recognizable figures, interestingly, in the Democratic Party. Like, other than Biden, like the names you've heard of are probably from this caucus. And again, I think that's because anyone who's the most extreme is going to get more airtime, I feel. Because it's like, someone in the Blue Dog Coalition talking about, oh, we're going to reduce prescription prices. That's not going to get as much like attention. Like, not as many people are going to watch the news. Like, if you think about it from a news perspective, right? And it's like, we can have on someone from the Blue Dog Coalition or the Progressive Party. It's like, okay, the Blue Dog Coalition guy is going to propose like reducing healthcare costs and stuff like that. People might be bored. But the Progressive is going to say, we need universal healthcare, right? We need Medicare for all. And that's going to like get people watching. And then, of course, the same goes for on the Republican side with the Main Street Partnership and the Freedom Caucus, because, again, the most extreme positions are the most interesting, I guess, in terms of sensationalism, which is probably unfortunate. I would say, yeah. But anyway, so let's get into these names. So the people we have on here are Maxine Waters, Ilhan Omar, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Other members that you may have heard of, but we don't have their pictures here, are Ayanna Pressley, Rashida Tlaib, and Cori Bush. So, so their position is, so going through some of their positions, their position on climate change, again, they mentioned climate justice, and that's the thing I don't really understand that much. But they also want to reduce military spending. Very explicitly, they state that, which is probably fairly unique to this caucus alone. The New Democrat Coalition is probably more, again, like Biden's military budget, I think, that came out like a month ago or something, increased military spending by like $15 billion, which is like technically an increase, but then at the same time, due to inflation, it's like kind of like a bit of a decrease, but again, not that drastic. The Progressive Caucus would have actually wanted to, like, if a candidate from the Progressive Caucus was president, they would actually want to actively reduce the military budget. So they want to overhaul the immigration system. They want universal access to college. They want to relieve student debt in favor of universal health care. They want DC to be a state. That's an interesting one. I think that's become like a Democrat position in general. The DC statehood recently. I think Nancy Pelosi was in favor of it, and she's the Speaker of the House. Where would you put? Actually, I bet she's probably a member of one of these, isn't she? Do you know what? Because Nancy Pelosi is the Speaker of the House.
I bet she's in the New Democrat Coalition.
Let's see. I feel like I would have seen her name because we were looking for. Let's see. It was established. Oh, interesting. It says Nancy Pelosi is in the Progressive Caucus.
I think she.
She's a former member.
Yeah.
She's a former member of the Progressive Caucus. So she's not in it anymore, but she was at one. she left when she was elected to House Minority Leader. That's probably just due to like a trying to not appear like a conflict of interest sort of thing, like trying to say like I'm for all Democrats. I bet like if you would look at other minority leaders and majority leaders, they would all do a similar thing. So yeah, I guess Nancy Pelosi is in the Progressive Caucus. I don't know. What do you guys think about that? Do you think that's like
interesting? Because I see a lot of AOC versus Nancy Pelosi. Like AOC's trying to force Nancy Pelosi to bring Medicare for all to a vote or stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think... I would agree that she should probably be in the NDC. She left the Progressive Caucus in 2003.
Okay.
So
there was probably a lot of change.
Yeah, the Progressive Caucus that she was a member of, I would say, looks very different than the one that we are all familiar with.
Okay, so that makes sense. Yeah. So, yeah, that's the Progressive.
Yeah. So those are the Democratic caucuses. Definitely a wide range. It's interesting because I would say the most known figures that we talked about are more off to the left. Like a lot of people are familiar with the three we have up right now. We said that Biden and Pelosi, two obviously very well-known individuals, will probably fall into the NDC. So
where would you put? I'm just curious. Kamala Harris. Where might you put her? Vice President.
That's interesting. I don't know a lot. I would say what would really depend is her fiscal stance. I am personally not too familiar with her stance fiscally. I know a bit more about her track record as she was a DA, right? Or she was a general attorney.
Yeah. I forget.
And her stance
I
on
remember
like
she was a
progressive
senator
things.
from California. But...
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I would have
So
to.
that's another situation where we
that.
can't actually know which congressional caucus she was in because these are House caucuses and she was a senator.
Yeah.
So yeah. Yeah. I guess so. Let's go to the next one. Next, we have the Republican Main Street Partnership. So this is an interesting one because all the other ones have been solely House caucuses, but this one is a House and Senate caucus. That's why we have one of these people as a senator. On the left, we have Susan Collins of Maine. But then otherwise, there's Adam Kinzinger and Elise Stefanik. Or Stefanik, I don't know how to pronounce it. But so these are some interesting ones because recently there was a whole like controversy with Liz Cheney. And Elise and like Liz Cheney was a co-chair of the Republican, like, I don't know. She had like leadership as a Republican, and she was ousted from that. And the person who replaced her was Elise Stefanik. So it's interesting that she's part of this more like centrist group. But yeah, so their general positions, as we mentioned, they seem to be fairly close to the Democrats. They talk about social issues a little bit and from a more democratic position, whereas the Republicans, generally have the opposite positions on social issues, right? And they're in favor of red flag laws, which they put on their website, which is more of a Democrat thing. That's a red flag laws. It's like a gun control law. And so you would expect Republicans to be opposed to it. But again, these Republicans are more in favor of, like, they're more in line with the Democrats. I would say the main difference between the Main Street Partnership and the Democrats is in economic policy. So they probably share more of the Republican fiscal conservatism, but a lot of their social policy and then like sort of laws about like things are more in line with the Democrats in certain areas. Although they didn't mention legalizing drugs, so I would assume that they are probably agree with the mainline Republicans on that rather than the Democrats. But yeah.
This is very, very off topic, but I just wanted to know if you guys know this. I feel like this goes into the long-standing joke of how pretty much anyone can become the governor of California, like how famously Arnold Schwarzenegger was.
Yeah.
Like people that don't really have a background in politics can become the governor of California. I don't know if you guys know this, but Caitlyn Jenner a while ago announced that she's going to run for governor of California. You know, again, that's someone that does not have any political background. Like, you know, they were an Olympian, which is really cool. But
yeah,
you know, but hey, if Arnold can,
yeah, that is interesting. Well, yeah.
To be fair, Caitlyn currently has like 94% actively opposed to her candidacy. So,
94% of California voters.
Yeah, not even 94% have a other preferred candidate. 94% actively oppose her.
Oh my God,
that's weird.
Yeah, no, it is. She's running as a Republican
sense, though,
too.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. Huh. It does make sense for California, I would say, because it's where Hollywood is. So you would expect like more celebrity, people to become like politicians.
But her running as a Republican also doesn't really help her. You know, California is one of the most notoriously Democratic states.
Yeah.
I feel like she is the best candidate for, well, maybe not the best, but like a decent candidate for the Republican Party, in that like if she somehow won the primary, she is kind of in a way not going to have the same liabilities that other Republican candidates might have, in that she is more socially liberal, in that, and being trans would also help her, even though somehow she is trans but opposes trans rights, which will hurt her.
Yeah, she's an anomaly.
I didn't know much about that, but
yeah, I'm not too familiar with that, but I've heard that. I've heard a lot of people in circles around Caitlyn Jenner will criticize her for that, for exactly what Jacob just said. That weird dual standard.
I don't know.
Maybe not the best choice for governor of California. I don't want to take a stance here, but I would say
another interesting.
It needs peer review.
Another interesting thing is that it's like a recall election, so I'm not sure there is a primary. Like it's weird. I think Arnold Schwarzenegger was elected in the same way, where he had like 48% of the vote because like 2,000 people were running for governor. I'm serious. I think it was that high. Like you would open up.
Lord.
So the way that the recalls work, right, is that you get two questions on the ballot. The first question is, should we recall the governor? Yes or no. And then the second question is, who do you want to replace the governor?
Yeah.
And then it's all the different candidates. And how many? I'm going to look it up.
And Arnold was also a Republican, which is, odd for the governor of California to be Republican.
In California,
this is 2003, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Reagan's from California, right?
Yeah, no, that's also true, yeah. He was governor from...
What was it, 2003?
He was governor from 2003 to 2011.
Okay.
And that might not be something you'd expect.
All right, 2003 California gubernatorial recall. I want to find like a list of... Okay, I'm gonna put sample ballot. I'm gonna put official ballot. I'm gonna put this picture in for a second. Ah, shoot. This is your list of candidates. Like, that's a lot.
Is this for when Arnold was, or for today now?
This is Arnold Schwarzenegger. So this is 2003.
Did you throw it in the Discord chat? You put it.
Or
up
I
there.
put it in the slides. Yeah.
Look at that.
Yeah, like look at all that. Look at all these. Like, you got to zoom in. It's like
That's ridiculous. Where's Arnold?
yeah, where is he? I guess he would be
Oh, I
S.
see
I
him.
think this is alphabetical.
No, he's on the left in like that first list under
Oh, okay.
candidates to succeed Gray Davis.
Interesting. But anyway, so you might get a situation like that where there's like 200 candidates, and it's like
That's
that must be
crazy.
difficult. Like, so yeah, we'll see what happens with that. But yeah, I think that covers it. So now let's go to the next one, the Republican Study Committee. So here we have two members of the Republican Study Committee, and that is Dan Crenshaw and Liz Cheney. So Liz Cheney was the one we mentioned before. Yeah, so this is like in the middle, but also an interesting thing with all these caucuses that I forgot to mention is that a lot of members of Congress are part of more than one of these caucuses. So that's something to be like aware of. And I think the Republican Study Committee is probably like a general, like all Republicans committee that like most Republicans join, even if they're part of one of the other committees, right? So it's a weird thing. But yeah, but they have their positions. They want to reform on voting, like election security. That was a big issue during this election. They're also in favor of Section 230 reform, which is basically the way that the internet is governed. It's kind of complicated. I could explain the whole thing. I know about it because obviously we here at Gravity Max Media are an internet company, so it kind of pertains to us. But it's basically like, it's that Section 230 allows social media platforms to be sort of free of liability from like defamation. So if I were to go on this podcast and say like Sebastian is the spawn of Satan, right? Which is obviously defamation. If Sebastian were to say that's defamation, I'm suing you, he could only sue me and not YouTube, even though YouTube is the one hosting that opinion. And so Section 230 protects platforms from that kind of lawsuit. And it also gives them the ability to do some minor content, like moderation. They're allowed to moderate some content. But the key thing here, and where it ties into like Republicans versus Democrats, is that if the social media company is moderating too much, then they are considered a publisher, like the New York Times, for instance, would be probably a very good example of a publisher. And if I were to say, write an op-ed for the New York Times where I say Sebastian is the spawn of Satan, if he were to sue, he could actually sue the New York Times itself because they're considered a publisher. So their hosting my opinion is not just like a neutral sort of we host opinions. It's that they endorse it, right?
And that happened.
Yeah.
That happened not like fairly recently. I use that term loosely. I remember I had to do a project on it at some point. The New York Times got in trouble for running an op-ed written by, I believe it was Tom Cotton, who I think he's still a senator. Very controversial.
Yeah, he's a Republican senator.
Very controversial Republican senator, where he strongly criticized the Black Lives Matter movement, and basically went on to say a whole other slew of really like striking things. And the New York Times got like in big trouble for publishing that, even though it was an op-ed.
Oh yeah.
And they do have that disclaimer at the top, which is like, this is written by Tom Cotton. This isn't us, but still, they ran the thing and they got in like massive trouble with it. Especially because
not legally, but I think it was like other employees of the New York Times were like very upset about it. Right?
Because Tom Cotton like was also bordering on breaking a decent amount of laws himself there, because he specifically called out a couple of individuals. I believe Stacey Abrams was one of them, about and he was bordering. I don't know if it falls under the legal definition of slander or defamate or libel if it's written, but
Yeah, I forget.
all that
slander
stuff.
is spoken, right?
Libel is written.
Okay.
I know that from J. Jonah Jameson from the Spider-Man movies.
Nice.
But he's bordering on breaking the law there, which also adds a factor.
That is very interesting. So, like, the reason that people were mad at the New York Times is because it's generally understood that they are, like, responsible for what they put on their website, right? That they're a publisher. And so, basically, the Republican argument here is that, like, the Republicans like to talk about, like, internet censorship, right? Like, that's one of their campaign issues. Big tech, that's sort of connected with what they talk about. And so their argument is that the internet, like the social media companies, are acting too much like publishers. And that means that they should lose their protection, their like liability protection, because they're acting too much like publishers. And the hope, I imagine the hope is that they want the social media companies to do less moderation, because a lot of Republicans are getting, I guess, kicked off. I mean, Trump notably kicked off of Twitter, right? So by using Section 230 and by saying you are acting too much like a publisher, therefore you should lose your protections, it would sort of force the social media companies to scale back their content moderation so that they would behave more like a platform. And so then they would be able to keep their protections. And basically these protections, internet companies, like as we know it, they would not be able to operate without these protections. I mean, imagine if YouTube could get sued for every single thing a crazy person said on YouTube. What is it? Isn't it like there's like 4,000 hours of content uploaded to YouTube every minute, right? There's no way they could go through all that. So by reforming Section 230 or enforcing or whatever they want to do, it would effectively force the social media companies to act differently. Otherwise, they would like collapse. So that's their position. Anyway, that was a bit of a rant.
It's interesting because pretty much everyone has said we want Section 230 reform, but they just want it for different reasons. Like a lot of Democrats want to scale back or alter 230 so that the companies are forced to do more moderation of things like hate speech or fake news. So they both say either reform or repeal 230, but for entirely different reasons.
Interesting. Yeah, repealing 230 would not be a good idea. I mean, and I don't mean to take a position, but like just entirely repealing it instead of like, I don't know, altering it in some way, but entirely repealing it would destroy the internet. And I think I'm going to take the position that I am pro internet existing because I like making these videos and podcasts. So yeah. But anyway, so other issues, they say tough on China. That's another Republican talking point. You could probably make a compilation of Donald Trump saying China, or however he says it. So they want to sort of enforce another thing, migration. They want to curb illegal immigration, and their healthcare position is sort of similar to what we were talking about with the Blue Dog Coalition, but a bit more precise. And it's about reducing healthcare costs, like through the free market rather than like making a universal healthcare system. So that's sort of interesting about how they might accomplish that. I don't know, but there are certain ideas like you could, like generics. This is an interesting thing I learned about, and that is that when you invent a new prescription drug, you only have a patent for 10 years or 20 years, I think, if you get it extended. And so that means that there are a lot of drugs from like 10 or 20 years ago that are technically public domain now, but no one like manufactures them anymore. And the reason is that the pharmaceutical companies make like slight improvements and then make new drugs. And so the idea would be that if you could get like generic drug manufacturers to produce these like 10-year-old public domain drugs, then they could do so at a much lower cost. Because it's really interesting with pharmaceuticals is that they are so much more expensive than it actually costs to produce them, like by like a ridiculous factor. I saw this like ad, like it's a company called like GoodRx, not sponsored, but it's like coupons or something, where it's like they showed in the ad. I'm not sure if this is an exaggeration, but it's like they were at a pharmacy, and on the like cash register, it showed like $60, right? And then the person shows them their phone with like the GoodRx app on it, and then it reduces to $8, like a factor of 10, crazy margin. So it is kind of weird how expensive prescription drugs are, and if the Republicans could figure out a way to reduce that, that would be very big for them, because they all sort of agree on opposing universal health care. But the problem with that is that if you don't provide something else as an alternative, then people aren't going to vote for you. Like, you know what I mean? Because basically, I would say probably the vast majority of voters agree that there's like an issue with healthcare costs being too high. And so the Democrats are saying, here's our solution. We'll provide universal healthcare. And the Republicans aren't really as strong on that. They are strong in saying, we don't want to do universal healthcare, but they aren't very strong in saying, here's our own thing that we want to do. And that makes voters less likely to vote for them. So if they could figure out a like coherent healthcare plan, I think that would be that's a very big priority for them in terms of like electability. But yeah. All right. And then also increase military spending. They mentioned peace through strength, which is a Reagan callback. So there you go. Yeah, that's about all I have to say about these guys.
Not anything on topic, just read it. Apparently, Arnold's wife of over 30 years, they did get divorced, but of over 30 years is JFK's niece.
Interesting. Weird. I did not know that.
Strange. It's a strange
There's a lot
world.
of Kennedys. Like, there's a lot of Kennedys, like, in politics.
Actually,
like, isn't there still a senator that's a Kennedy?
Yeah.
I think there is, but I'm not sure if he's related.
Oh, okay.
Let's check. John Kennedy. John N. Kennedy.
Ooh, curse.
He's from Louisiana. He's a Republican.
He turned on his family.
Let's see. On F. Not showing if he's related.
Very weird. Is it just a common name?
I've met people with the last name Kennedy who are not related.
Yeah.
He is not related to the Kennedy family of Massachusetts.
Okay. Interesting.
Shame.
So I guess that's just a common name. I did not know that. Anyway, so that, I guess, brings us to the last one. And so that is the House Freedom Caucus. So here we have some figures. These people have been in the news a lot. Not necessarily, not really for good reasons.
Yeah.
So mired in controversy, these people. So from left to right, we have Matt Gaetz, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and Jim Jordan. Jim Jordan's the one that founded the Freedom Caucus, and you may not have heard of him because I would say he hasn't been in the news a lot for various scandals, whereas the other two have.
Wow.
There's just a lot. I don't know why they're in a lot of scandals, but they are. And here's another thing. For all the other ones, we had an official website to go to, but for the Freedom Caucus, we couldn't really find an official website, but they did have a Twitter. So this is kind of based on what they say on Twitter. So I hope that's not horribly inaccurate. But yeah, they are generally very like strong, sort of in opposition to the Democratic Party. They just basically say the opposite of whatever the Democrats say, like very much so. So they're opposed to universal health care, obviously, opposed to free college. They want to, so they actually, so Sebastian, you said they actually wanted to build the border wall, like
One of
literally.
one of their Twitter posts was about all these pictures of unused fencing around the border, and it was, I believe it was Jim Jordan directly, and he was criticizing Biden for not, quote, using that stuff, like using the fencing stuff and just having it laying around.
That's interesting because all the other Republicans generally support tougher immigration laws, but most of them don't literally support building a wall, because I think it's like, in terms of, if you do want to have a strong like migration enforcement policy, building a wall like isn't the most practical way to do it. Yeah. Is what I've heard.
Out of the three caucuses, I would say this is the one that aligns themselves the most frequently with Donald Trump.
Yeah, that's fair to say. Yeah, I would guess if Trump were to be a congressman, he would probably join this caucus. Just because it's also, I would say they are more like confrontational, I guess you could say. So obviously they're lower taxes and stuff like that, but I say they get into a lot more like culture war issues, which is interesting because you sort of think of the culture war as like a lot of like Democrat social issues, and like most Republicans try to just not talk about it as much as possible. But then Trump, as well as these Freedom Caucus members, are very much more active in the culture war. One thing is recently is that there's the January 6th commission that they were trying to pass in the House. I think it failed, right? They wanted to establish like
the Senate.
Okay, so it failed in the Senate. It would have like established like a 9/11 style commission to like investigate the Capitol riot, and so the Freedom Caucus people were opposed to it. But then, other than that, I said a lot of petty issues. Now, again, I'm not trying to like sound partisan or anything, but what I mean by a petty issue is that one of the things they were complaining about on Twitter was that. So the CDC has said that fully vaccinated people don't need to wear masks. However, Nancy Pelosi has kept in place the rules in the House that say when you're in the House of Representatives, you have to wear a mask, which is like, okay, maybe that's not the best, position, but is that really that important, right? It's not really that important if you have to wear a mask in the Capitol building specifically. Like that's a policy that literally only affects one building in the entire country. Like, I don't really care. You know what I mean? Like, one way or another, it's like that doesn't really affect, the people of America. So that's kind of what I mean by like petty issues here, is that there's a lot of sort of like sort of bickering, sort of like partisan bickering kind of stuff, where it's like, is it really the most important thing right now of like whether or not you're wearing a mask in the Capitol building specifically? Like, they're not even debating on like, say, a national policy of mask wearing, right? Because then that might be understandable a little bit more. Say if it's like, if it were a law that like you have to wear a mask, something like that, then I could understand. But this is literally about one building, right? So that sort of, I feel like, characterizes the Freedom Caucus, is that they're a lot more like boisterous and like confrontational in terms of like culture war things and like in the news cycle. I don't know. It's kind of hard to explain, but
yeah, I think that does it for the Republican caucuses. Again, I would say it's very hard to compare the two, but I would say a similar range to the range that the Democrats had. Like, I would say the median of the Republicans is mirrored by the median of the Democrats. And, that in and of itself is again, speaks to the inevitability of the two-party system. But, again, the Republican Party right now is fragmenting. And it's a little insane to think that it is pretty much the result of one man, Donald J. Trump.
Yeah.
I don't think that's really happened before, but what we kind of do see, and I've seen this term kind of thrown around, or terms similar to how when, like, there was the Jacksonian Democrats, like, there was specifically Jackson's name tied to that.
I feel like that's the most similar historical scenario, where it was like people, like the Whig Party, when it first united, was united against Andrew Jackson specifically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, it's interesting to live through this period of time, but I really do think that the seventh party system is going to be strong for the Democratic Party, and be characterized by centrist Republican presidents. You know, if there will probably be either one or two, and I would say both of them will be centrists.
I don't know. That is kind of strange, though, because Trump
is included.
Wasn't
in
a
the
centrist.
Seventh. Yeah. If he's included in the seventh, then he would be the outlier. But I would say, the next two Republican presidents following Trump will be much more centrist. That's my prediction, just going by the historical trend.
My personal prediction is that both parties will become more populist. The Republicans shifting more towards Trump-style populism, and the Democrats shifting more towards Bernie-style populism.
So that would also mean that partisanship is going to increase. So, you also believe that?
I think possibly, yeah. I feel like whether or not it favors one party or the other in the end, I think it's too early to call.
Yeah.
Especially
it is really. Especially
it is
interesting. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
It's okay. Especially since the current predictions show the Dems losing the House and probably the Senate in 2022. So whether or not it's stronger for them, I think it's too early to call.
Yeah, it is interesting though in terms of like partisanship on like the populist candidates. Like there is a strange like cross-sectional like agreement between like the Bernie camp and the Trump camp, particularly back in like November or October with the whole like stimulus check thing, where Trump said that they should do a $2,000 or no wait, this is in December, sorry. They should do a $2,000 stimulus check, and Biden is like Bernie is like, for once I agree.
Yeah.
So like that's a weird like.
What is this? A crossover episode?
Yeah, and then the main person who was against it was Mitch McConnell. Like that's such a strange like how does that happen, right? Because you think like, so it's like Democrats and Donald Trump in agreement, but then other Republicans not in agreement. Very weird also, how the chips fall sometimes.
Yeah, there's some other examples of that. Notably, who is it? From Missouri. The senator from Missouri. I'm blanking on his...
Josh Hawley?
Yeah, he put in an amendment to require a $15 minimum wage for big corporations. And that didn't get passed, but it was as much as I don't like this theory, it is an example of horseshoe theory. I
That is interesting.
Strongly dislike horseshoe theory, but in this case it holds up.
Yeah.
That is interesting. But yeah.
I think that just about does it.
Yeah, that just about covers it. So now we're going to go into the two largest third parties in America. So I guess the third and the fourth parties in America. And they don't actually have, again, any federal representation. One of them did briefly, but not anymore. So let's just get into that. We have the Libertarian Party. So the Libertarian Party...
Swanson.
The Libertarian Party in 2019 had one congressman. And the reason is that he was elected as a Republican and then switched to the Libertarian Party, and he was not reelected.
Oh.
So, yeah, I think he like,
himself.
I think he saw like the writing on the wall. Like, I don't think he actually re-election. And that sort of speaks to the problem here is that like, generally you're not going to see either of these third parties really making any like winning any even congressional races. Sometimes they do win local and then state representation. That's their main field, even though interestingly they do run a presidential candidate every 4 years, which I feel like is ill-advised. I don't know, just doesn't seem like a good idea. Like I don't think ever in American history you've had a president get elected while literally zero congressmen are of their party. You know what I mean? It's like, I feel like you got to go like, you got to learn to crawl before you learn to walk type of thing. Like, how are you going to get a presidential candidate to win if you can't even get a congressional candidate to win, right? But I think it's probably more for the publicity. I don't know.
A figure that is often associated with the Libertarian Party and the Libertarians' pick for presidential nominee is Joe Jorgensen, or Joe Jorgensen, however you want to say it, commonly referred to as JoJo. And I think I just find this really funny. First of all, she finished third in the popular vote in the 2020 election. She actually got 1.8 million votes, which is pretty significant for like third party stuff like that. But yeah, she was also,
I think another.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, sorry, go ahead. I think Gary Johnson before her like got like 4% or something. I forget. I don't know how much that is.
Yeah, she got about 1.2%. So
okay,
yeah, less. But what I find very funny is that the city in which she was born is called Libertyville. I just think that's funny. That's a funny.
Yeah, that's interesting. But yeah, so the Libertarian Party, their party platform is pretty short and concise. They are basically like, their philosophy, I guess, is like individualism, like generally speaking. They believe in allowing people to make their own choices, but then also you will suffer the consequences or reap the benefits depending on how those choices turn out. So it's very much like you got to rely on yourself kind of thing. So yeah, and they're just very generally opposed to the government getting involved in anything. Like, as much as possible, they are opposed to government intervention. If you want like notable libertarian thinkers, I would say the chief one that comes to my mind is Ayn Rand, and that's more objectivism, which is like her own thing. And the reason that comes to my mind is that I'm actually reading Atlas Shrugged right now. So yeah, and Atlas Shrugged, there's a lot of like this kind of thing, like what they say in the Libertarian Party platform. Well, that's like kind of what she's arguing for in that book. So it is a pretty interesting sort of party. They align with the Republicans on some things and then Democrats on other things. So for instance, the Libertarian Party platform says, let's take the like abortion argument. They effectively say that we're neutral, but we don't want the government to get involved. And so in practice, that means pro-choice because they don't want the government to interfere. Next is they oppose the death penalty. And then after that, they are in favor of the non-aggression principle. They don't actually say it in the platform. Like, they don't explicitly say non-aggression principle, but they say like self-defense. And that's basically what the non-aggression principle is. In the platform, they say violence is never justified unless it has already been initiated against you, in which case it is justified. And that's like a principle that they take from like all scales. So it's like, to the individual, it's that the individual should be able to defend themselves if they're like attacked. And then on a national basis, it's the US should not go to war unless we're. So that's like the principle they rely on. So then obviously they are very pro Second Amendment because they want people to be they want to allow people to defend themselves. So they want people to be well armed. They have sort of weak environmental protection. Like they had a paragraph on environmental protection and said basically if you damage someone's property with pollution, then they can sue you. But I feel like that still doesn't really take care of the tragedy of the commons situations where you sort of need well, I guess I'm not going to say what you need, but what happens in the tragedy of the commons situation is that each individual, it's to their benefit to take advantage of the environment, and the collective action of all of these individuals doing that results in degradation, but no single person deciding to act in a better way is going to stop it, right? So it's how do you deal with that? Generally, that's where the government steps in. They are very much anti-taxation, and to a very, very far degree, much more than the Republicans, because the libertarians are actually in favor of repealing income tax and getting rid of the IRS. They have that in their platform. So no income tax, no IRS. Income tax first came around in 1908. It was the 16th Amendment. 16th or 17th, I forget. But yeah, so that's a very far position. No Republican would ever say that position, right? It's the Democrat position is top individual income tax rate should be 39.6%. Republican position is top income tax rate should be 37%. Libertarian position is all income tax rates should be 0%, right? That's a very drastic difference. And yeah, so basically, to the greatest extent, this would drastically reduce the government's ability to spend on anything. Traditionally, if you go back in American history, very far, the government relied on tariffs and excise taxes, which are similar to sales taxes. So they don't actually explicitly say it in their platform because they just hate taxes. But I imagine that's where the government would rely on its funding, but it would be very stripped down. It would do very little as a government, right? They support a balanced budget because debts are basically the future generations have to pay the debt, and they never agreed to that. That's the argument. And then generally, laissez-faire economics, free market, very pro well, so this is weird. They're very pro free trade on a global scale, which means that you can't really do tariffs. So I don't know how they want to get any tax. Well, presumably they don't want any taxes, right? But there has to be some government, right? Because they do say their platform does rely on the government existing. It's just very stripped down. I don't know exactly what they want to do about it, but and this is just their party platform. There are a lot of different positions that individual libertarians take, right? They are opposed to requirements for licensing. There's a very funny clip from the 2016 Libertarian Convention where they're having a debate, and the moderator asks, should people be required to get a license to drive? And it's a great clip. I just love that clip. You should go watch it. Just try and find it. One of the guys says what's next? Needing a license to make toast in your own dang toaster? And then Gary Johnson, who is the front runner in 2016, who actually was their candidate, he says well, I think there should be some qualifications to drive, and then everyone starts booing him. So that's just a funny clip. But then they are also in favor of allowing prostitution. They do not want that to be illegal. So yeah, that's interesting. They want education to be private rather than public, so no more public education. which is, again, a very radical position. If you like compare Republicans, Democrats, and then Libertarians, Democrat position is, free preschool, free college, or well, the most radical Democrats, at least all Democrats generally agree with like some sort of lowering the costs or something for college. Republican position is no handouts for college. Libertarian position is no K through 12 either that's publicly funded. It's like you got to go to a private school. Next, again, healthcare should be free market. So, right, no like Medicare or Medicaid even. Again, this is basically like taking the Republican position compared to the Democrat position and then like multiplying it by 10, right? They also they say that retirement, like having money at retirement, saving money for retirement is your own responsibility, not the government's responsibility. And so that effectively means no Social Security, which is also pretty crazy. That was an FDR policy, as we said. So yeah. And then also they want a minimal military spending, just enough to defend the country, but not to, they are opposed to being the world policeman, right? And then finally, they are in favor of like free immigration. So that's an interesting one, like as opposed to the Republican position. They are more in favor of allowing more people to immigrate, just allowing whoever wants to enter the country be allowed to enter the country. So a very interesting mix of positions here. Also in favor of legalization of drugs. So it's like, you see like on some issues, they side with the Democrats, on other issues, they side with the Republicans. I think it sort of goes back to your paradigm, Jacob, that you were talking about, where the Democrats don't want the government involved in like people's rights, but they do want the government involved in spending. And then the Republicans are the opposite. The Libertarians are like just the both government not involved in either, right? So they want low government spending. They don't want the government involved there, but they also want the government not involved in like infringing on people's rights. So that, and they take it to the like nth degree, right? They take it to the most like intense place. But yeah.
I will say though that the Libertarians have not really gotten office on their own, but they have had some success running under the Republican label. Like Barry Johnson was governor of New Mexico. You had currently have few representatives or senators who lean somewhat libertarian, not as extreme as the actual libertarian platform.
I would say probably Ron Paul. He's not there anymore, but he would probably.
But his son Rand Paul is, and Rand Paul is like halfway between conservative and libertarian. And what's the other one? Massey, I believe. Mike Lee. Okay. Mike Lee is a senator from Utah, and he has a bit of a libertarian streak in him.
So,
yeah. Republican.
Yeah, so it is interesting because I would say generally the Libertarians probably like align more with the Republicans than the Democrats, even though they share a lot of ideas. Like when it comes to, like, it seems like, are there any Libertarians that run as Democrats or?
I mean, it depends on what you call it. Like, you could call Bernie Sanders an individualist and just a left-wing libertarian, but in the American definition, where it's libertarianism is a right-wing economic ideology, not really.
Okay. So yeah, that's interesting. So then next we have the Green Party. I find the Green Party interesting. When I read their platform, I feel like the best way to sum them up, and I don't mean this as an insult, is like hippies. But hey, hippies are cool, okay? I'm not anti-hippie, but I feel like this is like sort of where that sort of like 60s style like hippies, I feel like this is where they would be. I don't know. But yeah, so some things they are in favor of. They are in favor of ranked choice voting and the popular vote for president. So that's a pretty interesting one. And it makes sense that since they are a third party, they would be in favor of ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting, I mean, it's exactly as it sounds. You rank your choices, you rank your preferred candidates. That voting system is better for third parties, whereas the system we have now, which is called first past the post, is much better for two parties. So it makes sense that they would be in favor of that. They're also in favor of federally funded preschool, like similar to the Democrats, to Biden. They want media reform, and this is interesting. They said like the main media companies have too much of like a profit motive, and they want like more individual, like small scale, like media enterprises. Like they sort of want to break up the big media enterprises, like it's like it's a trust, like they're trusts, right?
Curious how they go about that without running into First Amendment issues.
Yeah, that is interesting, because they are also generally, pro free speech. They mention in their platform the peaceful exploration of space, which I like that. They said that like in the U.S.'s like past 4 wars, a lot of like spy satellites were used and like stuff like that, and so they say like the militarization of space is bad. I obviously don't really follow up with like Green Party people, but I imagine when like Trump instated the Space Force, they probably weren't happy about that, based on this position. Then obviously they're in favor of women's rights, social justice, environmental justice, all that sort of thing, just sort of similar to the Democrats there. They're also in favor of universal health care. They want to reform criminal justice, make it more rehabilitative. Like, I guess, like Scandinavia is probably the typical example where, like, in Norway, like, the prisons are like a resort. I mean, I don't want to speak to the exact, I don't know, I'm not an expert, but apparently it's like comparatively to American prisons, it's very nice. So, that kind of thing. They are also in favor of like more free migration, open borders. Again, like it's sort of similar to the libertarian position here, where it's like people should not be restricted on like where they want to live, which is an interesting position. So they are also anti-nuclear energy. They don't like the use of nuclear energy. And here's another one. They are in favor of UBI, which is interesting. It's like Andrew Yang. I wonder if Andrew Yang is more of a green. Literally, the only policy proposal I know Andrew Yang for is UBI. I don't know the rest of his policy proposals, but it's interesting because the Green Party obviously is the only party of the 4 that we've talked about that are in favor of a UBI as a party. So that's just interesting. They're in favor of a progressive income tax, which is what we have now. It just means that the tax rate increases. And then they're also pro small business, and they are in favor of strong antitrust laws. And so that's pretty interesting. Like they have a few overlaps with like the libertarian here. Like I think the Green Party has like some interesting like overlaps with the Libertarian Party. Because I would say a big part of the Green Party is that they really don't like corporate interests. They don't like, money in politics. They don't like big companies. So since they don't like big companies, but they don't mind small companies, right? Better to have small companies than big companies. And they want to reduce the national debt. Everyone wants to reduce the national debt. Will anyone do it, though? That's the big question. But anyway, so it is really interesting. These two like lesser known parties, they don't really have much of a chance in any federal elections because, they just haven't really won anything, not even in Congress. So it's like, what you gonna do? But I think they do run a lot of like local state campaigns. And I think that is probably where they should focus more. I imagine the reason that they run presidential candidates is that the people that are the least initiated in politics probably only think of presidential elections. if you know what I mean. Like the people that are the least interested in politics will still at least every 4 years be like, okay, I'm going to vote for one presidential candidate or another. And so if you have a libertarian candidate or a green candidate, this time around the green candidate was named like Howie Howard or something like that. I forget. But if you're running, and before that it was Jill Stein in 2016. So if you are running a presidential candidate, then you're going to get some PR, and maybe that PR will help you get more awareness so that you can run successful like state and local campaigns. That would be my main idea as to a rationale to run a presidential candidate when you're only clocking like 2% of the popular vote, right?
Yeah.
So that's probably why they do it. But otherwise, their main victories are in more local representation. So
one thing I will say is, even though the Green Party gets less support than the Libertarians as a party, I think their agenda has a lot more power, in that the Green Party and the Progressive Caucus of the Democrats are pretty close. Not some issues which are different, but they're much more aligned. Like, I'd say that they're definitely much closer than the Libertarian Party and the House Freedom Caucus. So
yeah, that
like,
is
Bernie
that is
Sanders would
interesting.
be perfectly at home in the Green Party.
Yeah. So the Green Party doesn't do as well because they are like too similar to the Democrats or like some of the Democrats. So they like don't get as many votes. Whereas the Libertarians are more like on more issues are disaligned with the Republicans. So
Yeah, I do not think Marjorie Taylor Greene would be welcome in the Libertarian Party.
probably not. Yeah, probably not. Yeah. So again, interesting. That's all the part. I mean, there are more parties that we could have included, but we didn't feel like it, so we didn't. There are more. I mean, you could argue that these two aren't relevant, but I think they're like kind of relevant. Past this, you get like Constitution Party. There are still Whigs, surprisingly. They're irrelevant.
Wow.
I'm sorry.
There's the American Communist Party.
Oh yeah, the American Communist Party, American Socialist Party, as well. The most successful candidate, I think, of the American Party was Debs in the 1910s. Go back to our elections episode to watch that, to learn about that. We talked about it there. But yeah, so there are a few parties. Yeah, it's funny. We had a like mock election at my school, like this year, like in 2020. And they put like all the candidates on there. Biden won by like 70%.
Wow.
He got 70% of the vote. I found that kind of surprising. I guess it's not that surprising, because I was surprised because like I'm living in Florida, and like here in Florida, I think the state itself was like, I forget exactly, maybe like 48-49 in favor of Trump. I mean, we voted, like the state went for Trump. But that, I guess, speaks to just how much young voters are more likely to vote for the Democrats. So it makes sense. But yeah, so, but what I was saying was that the mock election had all the different candidates. They had the Libertarian, the Green, the like Socialist, like very interesting. Yeah. But anyway, that concludes this episode. So final thoughts. What do you guys think?
It's been a journey. It has been a journey going all the way from Alexander Hamilton to hippies. You know, it's unprecedented, but you know, it's good. It's good. Honestly, like, you know, obviously we don't want to like take a stance here, but I do think the more political parties, the better, right? Because you want everyone's voice to be heard. That's what democracy is about. You want everyone's voice to be heard, and you know, you want like the widest wealth of opinions so that you can have the greatest quality of them, because they're directly correlated. The quantity and quality of ideas are directly correlated. The more ideas you have, the better ideas you'll have. You just have to weed through a bunch of insane ones to get to the real gold, you know? But I would rather have like a billion political parties than, just one. But that's just me.
Yeah. It is really interesting how it is a two-party system here in America, but based on the caucuses, it also seems like there is quite significant differences between candidates in a single party. And I think that sort of speaks to the importance of primary elections. Primary elections are often overlooked, and like the turnout rates of primary elections are like much lower than general elections. And I don't know, I think that's kind of like unfortunate because there's such a vast difference here. I mean, if you think about it, if there's a primary between someone in the Progressive Caucus and someone in the Blue Dog Coalition, like that could almost be more important than if the Blue Dog Coalition person were to run against a Main Street Partnership person, right? Like if you had two very centrist candidates, then really it was the primary that was more important, because if the two candidates are, the Republican and the Democrat end up being practically the same, but in the primary there had been a very progressive Democrat or like a Freedom Caucus Republican, then the primary itself was actually more important than the general election ultimately. You know what I mean? So it is kind of interesting, like the sort of significance that we pay to those different aspects of the elections. But yeah, I agree. More parties, the better. I think it would be interesting if the 6 caucuses that we talked about were actually just 6 different parties. You know what I mean? So you had like the Blue Dogs as like, that's the political party. Then you get the Democrats, and then you get progressives. And then you go back and you got like, I don't know, Main Streeters, then Republicans, and then, I don't know, Freedom. I don't know what you would call it, but it would be interesting if we had like 6 different political parties, because it would just make it more clear to people like the differences between all these parties. So I hope that this episode sort of helped to like inform people. I think the most important part here was about the different caucuses, because I feel like it's a lot. Like part of hyperpartisanship is that also people just generally will be like, anyone on my side is good, anyone on the other side is bad. And just as like blinding as the anyone on the other side is bad part is, the anyone on my side is good part is also pretty blinding, because again, there's a lot of differences between the candidates that are, quote, like on your side, right? So yeah, hopefully you learned a thing or two.
Yeah. I think
yeah, if that's that.
Just want to ask, is there chat? Because we've not checked that.
We forgot to check chat. Okay. We have Lounging About says, hello. Crazy Wolf said, wait, is it a bad thing for the smell of bakeries to go through the air?
If it's French food.
Yeah. And then Barry Rudin says, great title for this live stream, guys. Yeah, we were... Maybe, I don't want to quite say clickbait, but it was meant to be provocative.
Y'all got baited. I don't know if you noticed,
exactly.
But this entire episode has been about politics.
Yeah, exactly.
You've been pranked.
Exactly. Yeah. So, with that being said, thank you, Jacob, for being a great guest today.
Thank you guys for having me on.
Of course.
Yeah, it was really fun. It's always great talking to you. And yeah, thank you, everyone, for using the chat. Apologize that it took us all the way to the end to respond to your chat. You dip to the chat. Like we like talking.
That's my bad. I'm supposed to call it out. That's my bad.
No,
sorry, guys.
No, you got a lot of stuff to do. That's fair enough. No, I should pay attention to chat more too. But yeah, so thank you guys all for watching. And then thank you, Sebastian, for being my co-host as always.
As always.
So, yeah. All right. Goodbye, everybody. Enjoy your Memorial Day weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.